My name is Gwen, 33 years old, and my family just tried to steal my entire life. Until recently, my parents and my sister thought I was nothing more than a glorified bookkeeper making a mediocre salary. They sat across from me in a downtown Chicago courtroom, whispering and laughing as their highly paid lawyer tried to strip away my basic human rights. My parents claimed I was too irresponsible to manage my own affairs, let alone the inheritance my grandfather had recently left me. They petitioned the court to seize control of my bank accounts, my reliable 5-year-old sedan, and the apartment I lived in. Their lawyer smiled confidently, treating the hearing like a guaranteed victory. But they had absolutely no idea what was actually waiting for them. Before I reveal what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family who completely underestimated your true worth. The mahogany walls of the courtroom felt suffocatingly tight, but the chill in the air had nothing to do with the air conditioning system. It radiated directly from the plaintiff table. My mother Patricia sat with her hands perfectly folded over her designer handbag. She wore a pearl necklace and a heavily practiced expression of maternal sorrow. Next to her sat my father Richard, his jaw set in that familiar posture of absolute unyielding authority. Behind them in the gallery sat my younger sister Vanessa, rubbing her pregnant belly, as if to remind everyone of her delicate condition. Next to Vanessa sat her husband DeAndre. DeAndre, a tall, impeccably groomed black man who worked as a vice president at a mid-tier hedge fund, wore a custom-tailored suit that screamed new money. He also wore a permanent smirk that told the entire room he thought he was the smartest person alive. He leaned over the wooden barrier, whispering a joke into Richard's ear, causing my father to let out a short, arrogant chuckle that echoed in the quiet room. Their attorney, a man in a sharp gray pinstripe suit, paced back and forth in front of Judge Ramirez. He painted a masterful, devastating picture of a broken, incompetent woman. He spoke about me as if I were an unruly child who could not be trusted to cross the street alone. He told the judge about a severe panic attack I suffered when I was 22 years old, twisting a single moment of college exhaustion into a lifelong diagnosis of severe mental instability. He claimed that I was completely unfit to manage the $300,000 inheritance my grandfather had recently entrusted to me. He insisted that for my own safety and financial security, my parents needed full legal conservatorship over my finances, my medical decisions, and my property. According to their carefully constructed narrative, I was a lowly clerk, drowning in my own incompetence, desperately in need of their benevolent guidance to survive the adult world. I sat alone at the defense table, next to my attorney, keeping my face entirely blank. I did not cry. I did not object to the blatant lies being spoken aloud. I simply watched my family perform their designated roles. Patricia occasionally dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the part of the heartbroken mother, forced to take drastic legal measures to save her troubled daughter. DeAndre kept shaking his head in mock pity, checking his expensive watch every few minutes, as if this whole proceeding was a tedious interruption to his very important financial schedule. He had always despised me. He took every opportunity at family gatherings to remind me that his financial expertise made him the true success story of the family, while I was just a sad spinster, punching numbers into spreadsheets for a failing business. They needed my inheritance desperately, though they pretended this charade was about my well-being. I knew they needed it to fund the lavish, unsustainable lifestyle they paraded around on social media. The opposing lawyer finally concluded his dramatic monologue, asking the court to grant immediate and total conservatorship to Richard and Patricia. He returned to his seat, sharing a victorious nod with my father. The battle seemed entirely over before I had even spoken a single word. Judge Ramirez, a man known throughout the district for his strict demeanor and no-nonsense approach to family law, adjusted his glasses and looked down at me from the high bench. He asked my attorney if the defense had any closing remarks or documents to submit before he rendered his final decision. My attorney did not give a passionate speech. He did not call a long list of character witnesses to defend my sanity. He simply stood up, picked up a thick leather-bound folder with a federal seal stamped prominently on the front cover, and walked calmly toward the bench. He handed the sealed document to the bailiff, who respectfully passed it up to Judge Ramirez. My lawyer stated clearly for the record that we were submitting a certified federally authenticated declaration of my financial assets, along with a corporate audit report for the court's immediate review. He added that this single document would unequivocally prove my mental fitness and absolute capacity to manage my own affairs, beyond a shadow of a doubt. The courtroom fell dead silent. I watched Patricia shift uncomfortably in her chair, clearly annoyed by the unexpected delay in her victory. DeAndre rolled his eyes, whispering loudly to Vanessa that this was just a pathetic, desperate stalling tactic from a losing side. But I kept my eyes locked solely on the judge. Judge Ramirez broke the wax seal. He opened the heavy folder and began to read the first page. For several long seconds, the only sound in the large room was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Then the judge's expression completely transformed. The polite professional boredom of a routine family court hearing vanished entirely. The color drained rapidly from his face. His eyes widened, darting back and forth across the crisp pages, as if his brain could not process the staggering numbers and the dense data printed before him. He flipped hastily to the second section, the audit report, and his breathing audibly hitched. The silence in the room shifted from expectant to incredibly tense. Something was terribly wrong. Richard leaned forward, his arrogant posture faltering slightly as he watched the judge's visceral reaction. Patricia stopped pretending to wipe away tears. DeAndre sat up straight in the gallery, his mocking smirk entirely gone. Judge Ramirez dropped the heavy document onto his desk with a loud thud. He stood up abruptly, his heavy leather chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed his wooden gavel directly at my parents' table, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged chamber with absolute terrifying fury. "Stop immediately. Bailiff, lock those doors right now and call federal security." The atmosphere shattered into pure chaos. Panic erupted at my parents' table, but I remained perfectly serenely still. What exact numbers and dark secrets were printed on those pages that could make a seasoned judge call for immediate arrests right in the middle of a routine civil hearing? To understand how we reached this explosive moment, we have to go back exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks before the federal agents stormed the courtroom, the trap was set over a platter of roasted turkey. My parents hosted their annual Thanksgiving dinner at their sprawling estate in the wealthiest zip code of Chicago. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from the massive chandelier overhead. The dining room smelled of expensive catered food and thick, unspoken tension. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, wearing a simple gray cashmere sweater. My sister Vanessa sat opposite me, practically dripping in designer labels, her pregnant belly draped in imported silk. Beside her sat DeAndre, swirling a glass of vintage scotch, already holding court about his latest supposed triumphs at his hedge fund. I kept my eyes on my plate, eating my meal in silence. This was my usual survival strategy at family gatherings. I let them talk, let them boast, and let them believe they were the undisputed masters of the universe. My mother Patricia sat at the head of the table, her sharp eyes tracking my every single move. She had spent the first 20 minutes of dinner loudly lamenting how cramped Vanessa and DeAndre were in their luxury apartment. She hinted heavily that growing families needed significant financial injections, and that it was a tragedy how wealth was sometimes misallocated to those who had no use for it. My father Richard nodded along. His face was flush with wine and self-importance as he agreed that family wealth needed to be protected, managed, and consolidated under his expert supervision. I knew exactly where this conversation was heading. My grandfather had passed away 2 months prior. He was the only person in this family who ever saw me as capable, the only one who recognized my mind for numbers and strategy. Before he died, he bypassed my parents entirely and left me a direct cash inheritance of $300,000. For a family obsessed with total control and appearances, a financially independent scapegoat was their absolute worst nightmare. They could not stand the thought of me having resources they could not dictate. Patricia cleared her throat. It was a sharp, grating sound that immediately silenced the entire room. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and slid them straight across the table. The heavy papers bumped against my water glass. I looked down at the bold print on the very first page. It read, "Petition for Conservatorship and Asset Management." I looked up. My mother offered a smile so tight it looked physically painful. She told me they had been talking with their lawyers for weeks. She said it was time to be realistic about my personal limitations. She claimed the stress of sudden wealth was simply too much for someone with my fragile emotional disposition to handle. She promised that if I just gave them legal control, they would make sure I never had to worry about paying my rent or buying groceries ever again. Vanessa chimed in immediately, her tone dripping with fake condescending sympathy. She said they were just worried about my well-being. She pointed out that I lived alone, drove a 5-year-old sedan, and clearly did not know how to enjoy or manage real money. She rubbed her stomach protectively and added that the inheritance could be invested directly into the primary family estate, where it would actually grow and benefit the next generation, instead of sitting dormant in my checking account. I did not touch the papers. I simply looked at them and asked what exactly they thought they were doing. DeAndre let out a loud, mocking scoff. He set his scotch glass down with a heavy thud and leaned aggressively across the table. He told me to just sign the papers. He said I could not even handle college when I had a panic attack at 22. He demanded that I let them manage my grandfather's $300,000 inheritance. He reminded the table that I did petty bookkeeping for a living while he was a vice president at a major hedge fund. He looked me dead in the eye and stated that I did not have the mental capacity for this kind of capital. His sheer arrogance was suffocating, but it was absolutely nothing new. When I was 22, I had suffered a single severe panic attack after working 3 jobs to pay for the college tuition my parents flatly refused to cover. I had taken a brief semester off to recover. My family had weaponized that single moment of exhaustion ever since, using it as absolute proof that I was mentally incompetent. They conveniently ignored the fact that I finished my degree with highest honors and spent the next decade building a quiet but massive financial technology empire right under their noses. To them, I was still just the broken antisocial girl who did their taxes for free. They had no idea I was the founder and CEO of Sentinel Analytics. I looked at the conservatorship papers again. They were asking for total unyielding control over my bank accounts, my property, and my medical decisions. If I signed this document, I would legally become a child in the eyes of the state. My parents would have unrestricted access to my grandfather's money, which I now realized they desperately wanted for some unknown reason. I pushed the stack of papers back across the table. They slid smoothly over the polished wood and stopped right in front of my father's plate. I kept my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. I told them I was 33 years old. I told them I ran my own business and paid my own bills. I looked directly at DeAndre and told him my mental capacity was functioning perfectly well, which is exactly why I would never sign over my legal rights to people who view me as a personal ATM. I stated firmly that I was not signing a single page of their absurd petition. The fake smiles vanished instantly. The dining room went dangerously quiet. My father, Richard, turned bright, furious red. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white shirt collar. He slammed both of his fists down on the dining table with such explosive force that the silverware rattled violently against the fine china. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his voice escalating into a deafening roar. He called me an ungrateful, unstable embarrassment to the family name. He shouted that my grandfather was senile when he wrote that will, and that the money rightfully belonged to the primary estate. He demanded my absolute obedience. He commanded me to pick up the pen and sign the document immediately, or face the absolute ruin of my petty little life. He stood up from his chair, towering over the table, screaming that I had no idea how the real ruthless financial world worked, and that I would be completely destroyed without his protection. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back. I simply picked up my cloth napkin, wiped my mouth, and stood up from my chair. I looked at the red-faced, screaming man who was supposed to be my father and the family who sat silently agreeing with his abuse. I told them the dinner was lovely, but I had actual work to do. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room. My father was still shouting curses at my back, demanding I return to the table. Vanessa was whining loudly about how I was ruining her holiday and upsetting the baby. I grabbed my coat from the foyer and stepped out into the freezing November night, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me, cutting off their toxic noise. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, but it could not completely block the sound of Richard raging inside. Even through the thick brick walls of their sprawling Chicago mansion, I could hear him bellowing. I could hear Vanessa screeching about how I was ruining her holiday and stealing food from her unborn child by being so stubborn. I pulled my cashmere coat tighter around my shoulders against the biting wind and walked briskly down the long manicured driveway. The frosty air stung my cheeks, but the cold was a welcome relief from the suffocating toxicity of that dining room. I reached my 5-year-old sedan parked out on the street. DeAndre had mocked this car earlier, calling it a tragic reflection of my supposed poverty. He bragged about his imported sports car sitting in the heated garage. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine hummed to life, blowing cold air through the vents. I sat there for a moment with my bare hands gripping the freezing steering wheel. I expected to feel devastated. I expected the familiar crushing sting of rejection that usually followed these family ambushes. My entire childhood had been defined by this exact cycle of manipulation and punishment. But tonight, there were no tears. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calmness. The conservatorship papers were a bold, aggressive move, but they were also incredibly reckless. You do not demand total legal control over a competent adult unless you are running completely out of options. Richard and DeAndre were hiding something massive. My grandfather's $300,000 inheritance was clearly their targeted lifeline. They needed that cash, and they needed it immediately. I reached for the gear shift to pull away from the curb and head back to the city. Suddenly, the center console of my car lit up. My phone vibrated violently inside the cup holder. The screen flashed bright against the dark interior of the car. I assumed it was Patricia sending her usual barrage of passive-aggressive text messages, telling me how I had broken my father's heart and needed to return to the table to apologize. I expected a long paragraph about family duty and respect. I glanced down at the screen. It was not a message from my mother. It was an urgent automated alert from my primary personal banking institution. The text read, "Urgent fraud alert. Large outgoing wire transfer initiated. Reply yes to authorize or no to cancel." My blood went ice cold. I snatched the phone from the cup holder and immediately typed no. I hit send with my thumb pressing hard against the glass. I hovered over the screen, waiting for the automated confirmation that the unauthorized transfer had been stopped. The response took less than 10 seconds to arrive, but those 10 seconds felt like an absolute eternity. The second text read, "Alert. Transfer cancellation failed. Transaction has already cleared via authorized primary account holder." I pulled up my mobile banking app. My fingers flew across the screen as I bypassed the security firewall and accessed my personal checking ledger. This was the account I used for my daily visible expenses. I used it to pay for groceries, my basic utilities, and my car insurance. It was entirely separate from the massive corporate accounts and hidden wealth I managed for Sentinel Analytics. I kept exactly $45,000 in this specific checking account to cover my modest personal overhead for the entire year. It was my decoy account, the one my family believed contained my entire life savings. I watched the screen refresh. The loading circle spun for a second before the balance loaded. It read $0.00. I stared at the number, blinking hard to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me in the dark car. The entire $45,000 was gone, wiped out in a single digital stroke. I clicked fiercely on the transaction details to trace the route. The destination routing number was crystal clear. The funds had been wired directly into Vanguard Investment Holdings. That was Richard's private corporate account. My father had just emptied my bank account while I was sitting at his dinner table. My mind raced, trying to understand how my father had bypassed strict bank security protocols to authorize a wire transfer of that magnitude. I clicked into the account profile settings and pulled up the original establishment documents from the digital archive. Then I saw it staring back at me. The account history showed a custodial guarantor clause buried deep in the digital paperwork. When I was 18 years old, leaving for my freshman year of college, Richard had marched me into a local branch of this exact bank. He stood over my shoulder while I opened my very first student checking account. He insisted on attaching his name as a joint custodial manager, claiming it was strictly necessary in case I faced any campus emergencies. Over the past 15 years, my accounts had been upgraded, transitioned, and merged into premium tiers. I had long forgotten that his name remained permanently attached to this single foundational checking account as a legacy guarantor. He had never forgotten. Richard did not just steal from me in a fit of sudden explosive anger. This was entirely premeditated. The Thanksgiving dinner, the conservatorship papers, the insults from DeAndre. They were all part of a highly coordinated, multi-layered attack. My father knew that if I refused to sign over my grandfather's $300,000 inheritance, he would immediately trigger his backup plan. He waited until I was sitting at his dining table, distracted, belittled, and isolated to execute the wire transfer. He drained my personal liquidity to punish me for my disobedience, hoping the sudden financial shock would force me into absolute submission. He wanted me stranded, broke, and desperate. He wanted me to panic when my debit card was declined at the gas station. He wanted me to crawl back through that heavy oak door, fall to my knees, and beg for his financial mercy. He assumed that losing $45,000 would cripple me completely. To an ordinary person making a modest bookkeeping salary, a sudden theft of that magnitude would mean instant eviction, crushing debt, and absolute ruin. A dark, humorless smile slowly spread across my face. I locked my phone screen and tossed the device carelessly onto the passenger seat. Richard thought he had just dealt a lethal blow. He thought he had severed my only lifeline to the world. He believed he had successfully trapped me in his web of financial abuse. But my father had absolutely no idea that he had just stolen pocket change from a corporate giant. He did not realize that stealing this money gave me the exact legal leverage I needed to rip his entire life apart piece by piece. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the glittering lights of their mansion in my rearview mirror. I was not going to call the police to report a petty theft. I was not going to scream or cry or send angry messages demanding my money back. I was going to go home to my penthouse and initiate a silent, devastating war that they could not possibly win. The drive back to the city center was a masterclass in emotional control. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my modest sedan, navigating the icy, salt-stained streets of Chicago, while my mind processed the sheer audacity of my father's theft. $45,000. To the family I had just left behind, that number was a crippling blow, a guaranteed method to bring a supposedly struggling bookkeeper to her absolute knees. They expected me to pull over to the side of the highway, hyperventilate, and frantically call them in a puddle of tears, begging for access to my own money so I could pay my rent. They expected the broken, fragile girl from a decade ago. They did not expect the woman I had become. I pulled my car into the secure underground garage of a sleek, ultra-modern glass tower located in the most exclusive section of the Gold Coast. The private security detail nodded respectfully as I bypassed the main lobby and stepped into the private elevator reserved strictly for penthouse residents. The stainless steel doors slid shut and the elevator shot upward, leaving the noise of the city far below. I stepped directly from the elevator into my actual home. The penthouse spanned the entire top floor, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the freezing ink-black waters of Lake Michigan. This was the fortress I had built entirely on my own. My family believed I lived in a cramped budget apartment on the outskirts of the city, a lie I had carefully maintained by always offering to host them at local restaurants, rather than bringing them home. I did not take off my coat. I walked straight past the sprawling marble kitchen island and entered my home office. It was a room designed for warfare. 3 curved monitors dominated the massive desk, connected to a dedicated encrypted server rack humming quietly in the corner. I sat down in my leather chair and woke the system. The screen prompted me for a multi-factor authentication sequence. I typed in a 32-character alphanumeric password, inserted a physical encrypted key drive into the terminal, and leaned forward for the biometric retinal scan. The system flashed green, granting me full administrative access to the central nervous system of Sentinel Analytics. My real bank accounts loaded across the center monitor. The balances stared back at me in stark, glowing green text. Tens of millions of dollars in liquid assets, diversified international portfolios, and massive commercial real estate holdings. I looked from those staggering numbers to my phone, where the notification of my drained $45,000 decoy account still sat on the lock screen. A cold, genuine laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the quiet penthouse. I felt absolutely no panic over the stolen funds. In fact, I felt a profound sense of relief. For years, I had held onto a microscopic shred of hope that my family was just misguided, that their toxic behavior was born out of some twisted generational trauma. But my father exploiting a forgotten 15-year-old banking loophole to steal my safety net, just to force me into a fraudulent conservatorship, changed everything. That $45,000 was not a devastating loss. It was the cheapest, most valuable intelligence I had ever purchased. It completely eradicated any lingering guilt I had about destroying them. By crossing the line from emotional abuse into federal wire fraud and outright theft, Richard had handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to tear his empire down to the studs. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I executed a total corporate lockdown protocol. I initiated a deep sweep algorithm to ensure there were absolutely no remaining digital footprints, obscure tax links, or forgotten legacy accounts that could connect my true identity and wealth to the family estate. I authorized a blanket block on all incoming inquiries to my wealth management team, ensuring that when my father eventually tried to dig into my background, he would hit a solid brick wall. I effectively rendered myself a financial ghost. Just as I finalized the firewall configuration, my phone buzzed violently against the mahogany desk. I picked it up. A new text message glowed on the screen. It was from DeAndre. The message read exactly as I anticipated. Actions have consequences. Mom and Dad are just keeping your money safe until you get help. Stop being dramatic. Apologize to your father, and maybe they will give you a monthly allowance for groceries. He was practically begging to be destroyed. His sheer hubris was astounding. DeAndre actually believed he was the smartest predator in the jungle, completely blind to the fact that he was actively documenting an extortion conspiracy via text message. I did not reply. I did not block his number. I simply took a screenshot of the message, uploaded it to a highly secure encrypted legal file I was building on a separate server, and turned my phone entirely off. I let the trap continue to set itself in perfect silence. I finally took off my coat, poured myself a glass of water, and went to bed. I slept deeper and more peacefully than I had in over a decade. The next morning, the winter sun broke brightly over the lake, flooding the penthouse with brilliant, blinding light. I stood in my kitchen wearing a plush silk robe, the high-end espresso machine whirring quietly as it pulled a perfect double shot. I leaned against the cold marble counter, bringing the hot ceramic cup to my lips. I felt completely untouchable. The heavy, suffocating chains of family obligation had been entirely severed the night before. I was finally free to handle them the way I handled any other hostile corporate takeover. Then the sharp, persistent buzz of the private intercom shattered the morning calm. I set my espresso cup down and walked over to the security panel mounted on the wall. I pressed the communication button, expecting my usual grocery delivery service. Instead, the voice of Marcus, the building's head concierge, came through the speaker. He sounded uncharacteristically tense and highly confused. He apologized for the early intrusion. He reported that a massive commercial moving truck had just pulled directly into the building's private loading dock. He said a woman claiming to be my sister, accompanied by a very aggressive man, and a crew of movers, was currently in the lobby. They were shouting at the front desk staff, waving a stack of papers, and demanding immediate access to my unit. They claimed they had legal authorization to pack up my belongings and terminate my residence. The espresso suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. They were not just trying to steal my money, they were attempting to physically erase my life. I pressed the intercom button, told Marcus to hold them in the lobby, and walked calmly toward my heavy steel floor safe to retrieve a very specific document. Before Marcus could even finish his warning over the intercom, the heavy electronic deadbolt of my front door clicked loudly, followed by the sharp chime of the security system disengaging. 3 years ago, during a brief hospital stay for a minor surgery, I had handed my mother a physical backup key to my residence explicitly for medical emergencies. She had sworn up and down she lost it. Clearly, she had lied and passed it directly to her golden child. Vanessa marched straight into the entryway, her designer boots echoing sharply against the imported Italian marble foyer. DeAndre trailed right behind her, aggressively waving 3 burly men in matching moving company uniforms into my private sanctuary. For a fraction of a second, both Vanessa and DeAndre stopped dead in their tracks. Their eyes darted frantically upward, taking in the 20-foot ceilings, the custom floating glass staircase, and the sweeping, unobstructed panoramic view of the frozen Lake Michigan skyline. They had never actually visited my home. They always insisted I travel to their suburban events because my neighborhood was supposedly dangerous and beneath their social standing. DeAndre's jaw tightened visibly. He quickly recovered his arrogant smirk, returning as his brain made a massive, catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed I was renting. He assumed I was recklessly burning through my grandfather's inheritance to fund a lavish lifestyle I could not actually sustain on a bookkeeper's salary. He clapped his hands loudly, the sound echoing through the massive penthouse. He pointed at my custom curved velvet sofa and barked at the movers to start in the living room. He loudly instructed them to use plenty of bubble wrap on the high-end electronics because they would be keeping those for the new baby's playroom. The movers, looking incredibly confused by the hostility and the sheer wealth of the apartment, awkwardly set down their rolls of packing tape and stood by the door waiting for a clear signal. Vanessa sauntered into my kitchen like she already owned the place. She ran her manicured hand over the cold marble of the waterfall island, looking at my professional-grade espresso machine with a mixture of intense envy and deep disgust. She stopped a few feet away from me, protectively rubbing her swollen belly, and tilted her head. She put on that sickly sweet condescending voice she used whenever she was twisting the knife. She announced proudly that Mom and Dad had officially authorized them to take over my lease immediately. She claimed that their luxury downtown apartment was simply too cramped for a growing family. She stated that since my father was now actively managing my finances and had secured my assets last night, they had audited my living situation and deemed this penthouse a massive, irresponsible waste of family resources. She smiled, tracing the edge of the marble counter, and said they needed the space for the baby, and this location would do perfectly once they changed out the depressing decor. DeAndre strolled over, stepping uncomfortably close to me, trying to use his physical height for intimidation. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, and dropped it onto the pristine marble island. He told me it was the address to a cheap 300-square-foot studio apartment in a highly industrial neighborhood on the far outskirts of town. He smirked, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction, and said he had already paid the first month's rent and the security deposit out of the $45,000 my father secured from my checking account last night. He told me to consider it a generous family subsidy. He crossed his arms over his chest, looked down at me, and demanded I start packing my clothes right this second. He complained that the movers were on a tight hourly schedule, and he did not have time to watch me throw a pathetic emotional tantrum. He warned me that actions have severe consequences, and if I had just signed the conservatorship papers at dinner like a compliant, respectful daughter, they might have let me keep some of my cheaper furniture. I did not panic, I did not scream, I did not demand they leave my property. I simply stood there, letting the morning sunlight warm my back through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and took a long, slow sip of my espresso. The rich, dark roast tasted absolutely perfect. I swallowed the coffee, set the ceramic cup down on the marble counter with a soft, deliberate clink, and turned my back on them entirely. I walked unhurriedly across the sprawling living room. DeAndre shouted after me, his voice echoing off the glass walls, demanding to know what I was doing and warning me not to try calling the police because family matters were handled internally. I ignored his blustering completely. I walked past the frozen, uncomfortable movers and approached the sleek, modern wood paneling behind my desk. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner concealed seamlessly behind a framed piece of abstract art. The heavy steel door of my hidden floor safe hissed open smoothly. I reached inside the dark metal cavity and pulled out a thick, premium-grade legal folder. I closed the safe, letting the biometric lock engage with a heavy thud, and walked back toward the kitchen. My bare feet were silent against the polished hardwood. Vanessa was already opening my custom cabinetry, loudly criticizing my choice of minimalist dinnerware and musing about which walls they would need to knock down to expand the nursery. I stepped right back up to the kitchen island, standing directly across from DeAndre's crumpled piece of trash paper. I looked him dead in the eyes, matching his arrogant stare with absolute freezing indifference. I dropped the heavy folder onto the marble counter. The thick parchment slid out, revealing a heavily stamped, notarized legal document embossed with the official seal of the city of Chicago. It was not a rental agreement. It was not a residential lease subject to a landlord's approval or a guarantor's signature. It was the absolute unencumbered property deed to the entire top floor of the building, completely paid off in cash and registered solely under my name. DeAndre stared at the heavy parchment resting on the kitchen island. He blinked twice, his eyes scanning the official municipal seal and the bold black lettering. For a moment, the penthouse was completely silent, save for the low hum of the espresso machine behind me. Then DeAndre threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a harsh, forced sound that bounced off the glass walls of my living room. He slapped the marble counter with his palm and looked at Vanessa, shaking his head in mock pity. He told her I had finally lost my mind. He accused me of printing a fake property deed off the internet to try and scare them away. He leaned over the island, his face inches from mine, and sneered that a glorified accountant who drove a 5-year-old sedan could not afford the maintenance fees in this zip code, let alone own a $30 million penthouse. Vanessa immediately agreed. She crossed her arms over her maternity blouse and rolled her eyes. She told me to stop playing games. She said the movers were charging them by the hour, and if I did not start packing my boxes, they would physically throw my things into the freight elevator. She demanded I hand over the keys and accept the studio apartment they had so generously secured for me. I did not move a single inch. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me and looked directly at DeAndre. I told him he was right about one thing. I did not own the penthouse. DeAndre smirked triumphantly. He reached out to snatch the document off the counter, clearly intending to rip it up and throw it in my face. My hand shot out, pinning the document to the marble before his fingers could even graze the paper. I looked at his confused face and corrected my previous statement. I told him I did not own just the penthouse. I owned the entire luxury building. The smirk instantly vanished from DeAndre's face. He pulled his hand back as if the document had physically burned him. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the bold print designating the registered owner of the property. I read the name aloud, enunciating every single syllable perfectly. Vanguard Real Estate, LLC. I told them this was my primary holding company, a subsidiary of the Sentinel Analytics empire I had built from the ground up over the last decade. I explained that I purchased this entire residential tower 3 years ago in an off-market cash deal, upgrading the HVAC systems, remodeling the lobby, and quietly collecting the massive returns. DeAndre stared at the words, Vanguard Real Estate, LLC. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the page. I watched the absolute, unquestionable reality crash down upon him. The arrogant flush drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving him a pale, sickly shade of gray. He knew that name. He knew it very well. I tilted my head, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly even. I asked DeAndre to remind the room exactly who he wrote his exorbitant rent check to on the first of every single month. I asked him to recall the name of the holding company listed on his own lease agreement for the premium unit he occupied 20 floors directly below me. For years, he had bragged at family dinners about his building's rooftop pool, the private gym, and the elite concierge service. He had absolutely no idea he had been paying my mortgage the entire time. Vanessa frowned, looking back and forth between her husband and me. She tugged on DeAndre's tailored sleeve and asked him what I was talking about. She demanded he say something to put me in my place. She reminded him that Richard had just secured my $45,000 and that I was completely broke and defenseless. DeAndre could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He just stared at the municipal seal, his arrogant facade completely and utterly shattered. I looked at Vanessa and decided to twist the knife. I told her that the $45,000 our father had stolen from my decoy account last night was entirely meaningless to me. I explained that $45,000 barely covered the annual landscaping and snow removal budget for the front courtyard of this single building. I told her that Richard had committed federal wire fraud to steal what amounted to petty cash, and in doing so, he had handed me the exact legal leverage I needed to completely destroy his primary estate. The 3 burly movers who had been standing awkwardly near the front door suddenly realized they had stepped into the middle of a massive legal and family war zone. The foreman, a tall man with a thick beard, cleared his throat loudly. He looked at DeAndre, then looked at me and asked if they should take their equipment back down to the truck. I smiled at the foreman and told him that would be an excellent idea. I apologized for his wasted time and assured him I would personally call his dispatch office to authorize a full day's pay for his crew billed directly to Vanguard Real Estate. The foreman nodded gratefully, tipped his hat, and quickly ushered his men out the front door. The heavy deadbolt clicked shut, sealing the three of us inside. DeAndre finally found his voice. It was a weak, trembling whisper. He took a step back from the kitchen island, his hands raised defensively. He tried to claim this was all a massive misunderstanding. He stammered that Richard had forced them to come here. He insisted they were just following orders and that they did not want any actual trouble. He begged me to just let them walk away and pretend this morning never happened. I reached back into the thick legal folder resting on the marble counter. I told DeAndre that actions do indeed have consequences, exactly as he had texted me last night. I pulled out a single sheet of crisp white paper and slid it across the island until it stopped right at the edge, inches from his chest. Vanessa leaned forward to read the bold header. She let out a sharp, genuine gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. I looked at my brother-in-law and told him I was not just kicking them out of my penthouse. I informed him that as the sole registered owner of Vanguard Real Estate, LLC, I was formally terminating his residential lease. I told DeAndre that he and Vanessa had exactly 30 days to pack up their luxury apartment downstairs and vacate my building permanently. I smiled, motioning to the piece of paper he had brought me earlier, and suggested they might want to utilize that cheap studio apartment on the outskirts of town. DeAndre stared at the eviction notice as if it were written in a foreign language. The color that had previously drained from his face rushed back in a violent, angry crimson. He slammed his fist down on the marble island, rattling my empty ceramic cup. He shouted that I could not do this, that I was bluffing, and that the eviction was entirely illegal. He puffed out his chest, trying desperately to reclaim his shattered authority. He declared loudly that he was a senior vice president at a major wealth management firm, that he knew the law perfectly well, and that he would tie me up in corporate litigation for the next decade. I did not even blink. I picked up my tablet from the counter, unlocked the screen, and logged directly into the Vanguard Real Estate Resident Management portal. I bypassed the standard menus and pulled up the highly confidential financial ledger for Unit 4201. I turned the screen around and slid it across the cool marble so Vanessa could see it clearly. I kept my tone conversational and light, devoid of any malice. I informed Vanessa that her husband was entirely correct about litigation being a strong possibility, but absolutely not for the reasons he claimed. I pointed to the glowing red numbers screaming from the bottom of his tenant ledger. I read the outstanding balance aloud, ensuring every single digit echoed in the quiet kitchen. DeAndre was exactly 3 months past due on his rent. Vanessa gasped loudly. Her hands dropped from her pregnant belly to grip the edge of the counter tight enough to turn her knuckles white. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She turned to DeAndre, her voice trembling, and asked him what this meant. She aggressively questioned him about his massive year-end bonus, the imported German sports car he had just leased, and the diamond tennis bracelet he had bought her for their anniversary just last week. I smiled warmly at my sister. I explained that her husband was financing their lavish, picture-perfect lifestyle through sheer desperate delinquency. He was playing the role of an elite, wealthy finance bro, while secretly defaulting on his most basic living expenses. I told her that the only reason they had not been locked out a month ago was because my property management software automatically flagged family surnames for my personal review before initiating final eviction protocols. I had been sitting on his delinquent ledger for weeks, watching him dig his own financial grave, simply waiting for the perfect moment to collect my due. DeAndre lunged forward with a guttural shout. He swiped the tablet off the counter, sending it crashing onto the hardwood floor, cracking the glass screen. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He looked absolutely feral, his carefully manicured corporate persona entirely stripped away in a matter of seconds. He took a threatening step toward me, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He demanded that I wipe the ledger clean immediately and shred the eviction notice. I did not flinch. I simply tapped a single button on my smartwatch. It was a silent panic alert wired directly to the building's private security detail. I had instructed them earlier to remain on standby the second the lobby confrontation began. Within 15 seconds, the heavy double doors of my private vestibule swung open. Three massive, highly trained security guards stepped into the penthouse. Marcus, the head concierge, stood right behind them, his face a mask of stern professionalism. The burly, moving crew, who had been lingering in the hallway, waiting for the freight elevator to arrive, turned around to watch the unfolding spectacle. They had a front row seat to the absolute, undeniable humiliation of the man who had been barking arrogant orders at them just 10 minutes prior. I pointed clearly at DeAndre and Vanessa. I instructed the security team to physically escort the trespassers off the premises immediately. I added that Unit 4201 was now officially under watch, and DeAndre was not permitted to enter the building without an armed escort present to ensure he did not damage my property while packing his belongings. DeAndre opened his mouth to shout another threat, but the lead security guard clamped a massive, unyielding hand onto his tailored shoulder. The guard firmly advised DeAndre to walk toward the elevator immediately, or he would be physically carried out of the building. Vanessa burst into loud, hysterical tears. She wailed about her pregnancy, about the stress on the baby, and screamed that I was a heartless monster. The movers whispered among themselves, shaking their heads at DeAndre as he was marched past them, thoroughly defeated and visibly shaking with impotent rage. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator closed, swallowing their shouts and leaving my penthouse in perfect, pristine silence once again. I walked over to the bank of security monitors mounted on my office wall. I switched the feed to the ground floor lobby and the exterior entrance cameras. I watched the live high-definition broadcast of my sister and her husband being paraded through the opulent glass lobby by three imposing security guards. Several affluent residents stopped to stare at the unprecedented commotion. Vanessa completely covered her face with her designer handbag, sobbing uncontrollably as she scurried toward the revolving doors. Once they were deposited onto the freezing Chicago sidewalk, the exterior camera caught DeAndre pacing frantically near the curb. He was ignoring his crying wife entirely. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, jabbing at the screen with vicious force. He held the phone to his ear, his face contorted in a scream that the cameras could not pick up. I knew exactly who he was calling. He was running straight back to the architect of this entire disaster. He was calling Patricia. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up the broken tablet from the floor, and tossed it into the recycling bin. I wiped the marble counter clean and waited. The trap had finally snapped shut. The shockwave was traveling straight up the family chain of command, and the explosion was imminent. Exactly 10 minutes later, the peaceful silence of the penthouse was broken by the sharp, demanding ringtone of my personal cell phone. I walked over to the desk and glanced at the caller ID. Patricia's name flashed across the screen in bold, angry letters. I took a deep, calming breath, centered myself, and swiped the screen to answer. Before I could even utter a single syllable of greeting, my mother's voice exploded through the speaker. She was not just angry, she was completely unhinged, her voice shrill and echoing with absolute panic. "You have lost your mind. I am calling the authorities to put you in a psych ward where you belong." I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the darkened screen as the call abruptly disconnected. The threat hung heavily in the quiet air of the penthouse. I did not laugh, nor did I panic. I understood exactly what my mother was attempting to do. A 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold was the standard, brutal first step in establishing a hostile medical conservatorship. If they could get a doctor on their payroll to certify that I was fundamentally detached from reality, my father could legally petition the court to seize temporary control of my physical autonomy and, by extension, my financial accounts. I had precisely 3 minutes to secure my empire before the authorities arrived. I moved swiftly to my desk, bypassing the destroyed tablet on the floor, and picked up my encrypted landline. I bypassed my assistants and dialed the direct unlisted cell phone number of Harrison Sterling, my lead corporate counsel. He answered on the first ring. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the situation as a concise tactical briefing. I informed him that my parents had initiated a fraudulent medical ambush, likely armed with an expedited court order, citing severe delusions. I told him I would be turning my phone off and complying with the authorities to avoid a public incident. I instructed him to mobilize the entire legal team, pull my pristine medical records, and prepare a massive countersuit for malicious prosecution, defamation, and abuse of process. Harrison simply replied that it would be handled. I hung up the phone and waited. 5 minutes later, the private intercom buzzed. Marcus's voice came through the speaker, sounding deeply distressed and highly apologetic. He informed me that two armed Chicago police officers, accompanied by a pair of emergency medical technicians, and my mother, were standing in the lobby. They possessed a signed emergency judicial warrant demanding immediate access to my unit. I instructed Marcus to send them up. I walked to the entryway, smoothing the lines of my tailored trousers, and stood calmly waiting as the private elevator hummed to life. The stainless steel doors slid open. Patricia stood safely behind the broad shoulders of the two police officers, her face buried in a crumpled tissue. She was executing an absolutely flawless performance of a terrified, heartbroken mother. Her shoulders shook with manufactured sobs. The lead officer stepped forward, his hand resting cautiously near his utility belt. He looked around the staggering luxury of the penthouse, his eyes widening slightly before he returned his focus to me. He asked if I was Gwendolyn, and I nodded. He unclipped a clipboard from his vest and presented an expedited medical order. He explained his tone carefully, measured that a judge had signed a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold based on sworn affidavits from my immediate family. He read the justification aloud, his voice echoing in the foyer. The document claimed I was suffering from a sudden violent psychotic break, characterized by severe delusions of grandeur. The affidavit specifically stated that I falsely believed I was a billionaire, that I was claiming ownership of commercial skyscrapers I merely rented, and that I had exhibited erratic, threatening behavior toward my pregnant sister earlier that morning. Patricia let out a loud, theatrical wail from the elevator bay. She cried out to the officers, begging them to be gentle with me, claiming I had completely lost touch with reality and desperately needed heavy medication. The officer looked at me with a mixture of caution and pity. He explained that I could come quietly in the ambulance for a standard evaluation, or they would be forced to use physical restraints. In that fraction of a second, I calculated the exact trajectory of my next move. Physically resisting was out of the question. Fighting the police inside my own building would result in handcuffs, shouting, and an official police report of resisting arrest. The moment a video of the CEO of Sentinel Analytics being dragged out of her penthouse screaming hit the internet, it would trigger a massive media scandal. The board of directors would panic, investors would pull out, and my company's stock would plummet by billions of dollars before the market even opened the next day. A public spectacle was exactly what my father was counting on to legitimize their claims of my supposed instability. I looked the officer dead in the eyes, my expression a mask of absolute impenetrable calm. I told him I completely understood his position and that I would fully comply with the medical order. I calmly reached into my pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and powered it down completely before handing it directly to the EMT. I walked over to the hall closet, retrieved a simple black wool coat, and slipped it on. I turned back to the police, holding my wrists casually in front of me, and stated that I was ready to go voluntarily. The officers exchanged a highly confused look. They were clearly expecting a raving, delusional woman prepared to fight them tooth and nail. Instead, they were dealing with someone who was treating a psychiatric arrest like a mild scheduling inconvenience. The lead officer nodded respectfully, signaling the EMTs to lead the way. They did not touch me. They did not bring out the handcuffs. I walked out of my penthouse past my weeping mother and stepped into the elevator with perfect, unbroken dignity. The ride to the private psychiatric facility was silent. I sat in the back of the ambulance, my hands folded in my lap, watching the city streets roll by through the frosted windows. Upon arrival, the intake process was cold, systematic, and designed to strip away all personal autonomy. I was escorted into a brightly lit, sterile processing room. A stern-faced nurse ordered me to remove my coat, my clothing, my shoes, and my jewelry. I handed over my watch, my earrings, and my tailored clothes without a single word of protest. I changed into the stiff, scratchy cotton of standard-issue hospital scrubs. I was led down a long, white hallway and directed into a small, windowless evaluation room. The space contained nothing but a thin mattress on a plastic frame, a metal toilet bolted to the wall, and a single security camera staring down from the ceiling corner. Before the heavy, reinforced door swung shut, I caught a glimpse of the hallway through the narrow viewing glass. Patricia was standing at the intake desk, finalizing the paperwork with the facility administrator. She paused, turning her head to look directly down the corridor at my locked door. The fake tears were completely gone. Her posture was straight and her face was illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. She stared at the small window of my cell, a cold, triumphant smile spreading slowly across her face. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had successfully neutralized me, stripped me of my power, and secured the 72-hour window her husband needed to seize control of my assets and finalize the conservatorship. She smiled, turning back to the desk, completely unaware that she had just locked herself in a cage with a predator, and my legal machine was already preparing to tear her entire world apart. The heavy reinforced door of the evaluation room clicked loudly, breaking the absolute silence of my sterile enclosure. A man in a crisp white lab coat walked in carrying a thick manila folder. He possessed the exhausted, mildly irritated demeanor of a medical professional who believed he was about to spend the next hour dealing with a loud, uncooperative patient. He pulled out the single metal chair opposite my plastic mattress and sat down. He introduced himself as Dr. Aris, the chief psychiatric evaluator for the facility. He did not look at me directly at first. Instead, he flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the paperwork my mother had so generously provided. He asked me in a tone dripping with practiced, patronizing sympathy if I knew where I was and why my family had brought me here. I did not raise my voice. I did not shift my posture. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the knees of my scratchy hospital scrubs. I answered him with a voice so steady and freezing it caused him to finally look up from his clipboard. I told him the exact address of the facility, the name of the parent healthcare conglomerate that owned it, and the current trading price of their stock on the New York Stock Exchange. I then informed him that I was currently being held against my will due to a highly coordinated fraudulent medical ambush orchestrated by my father and executed by my mother, aimed at establishing a hostile conservatorship to seize my corporate assets. Dr. Aris let out a slow, condescending sigh. He tapped his pen against the manila folder. He told me that this level of paranoia was exactly what my mother had outlined in her sworn affidavit. He read aloud from the document stating that I had recently suffered a severe psychotic break. He read that I was exhibiting dangerous delusions of grandeur, specifically the hallucination that I was a billionaire CEO who owned the luxury high-rise building where I merely rented a small unit. He looked at me with deep pity and suggested that we discuss medication options to bring me back to reality. I extended my right hand palm up and politely requested to see the file. Dr. Aris hesitated, gripping the folder tightly. He stated that patient intake files were confidential. I countered instantly, citing my absolute legal right to review any medical documentation being used to justify an involuntary 72-hour hold under state law. I kept my hand extended, my eyes locked dead onto his. The sheer, unwavering authority in my gaze made him falter. He slowly handed over the file. I opened the folder and began my surgical deconstruction. I did not act erratic. I did not display a single ounce of the emotional hysteria my mother was banking on. I applied the exact same chilling, calculated logic I used during hostile corporate takeovers. I flipped to the second page and tapped a typed date with my index finger. I pointed out that the document claimed I had suffered a violent manic episode requiring emergency sedation on October 14th of last year. I looked at Dr. Aris and informed him that on October 14th, I was delivering the keynote address at the Global Finance Summit in Geneva, standing on a stage in front of 4,000 international bankers, an event that was broadcast live on financial news networks worldwide. I turned to the next page, skimming the clinical terminology Patricia had submitted. A sharp, humorless smile touched the corner of my mouth. I slid the paper across the metal table so Dr. Aris could see it. I asked him as a medical professional to explain how a patient could simultaneously be diagnosed with late-onset schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder while being prescribed two completely contradictory antipsychotic medications that, if taken together, would cause fatal serotonin syndrome. I pointed out that the medical jargon read exactly like a panicked, uneducated internet search copy-pasted into a Word document. I then flipped to the final page, highlighting the signature of the supposed attending physician who had signed off on my prior history. I asked Dr. Aris to run a quick search on his phone for that specific doctor. I watched his face as he pulled out his device, typed in the name, and stared at the screen. The blood rapidly drained from his face. The doctor listed on Patricia's documents had had his medical license permanently revoked 5 years ago for writing fraudulent prescriptions. The silence in the small white room was deafening. Dr. Aris lowered his phone, his breathing suddenly shallow. He was staring at me not as a patient, but as a massive walking liability. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. I did not shout, but my words hit him like physical strikes. I calmly recited the exact federal statutes regarding false medical imprisonment and the deprivation of rights under color of law. I outlined the devastating civil liability his clinic was currently exposed to for detaining a perfectly sane citizen based on easily disprovable forged documents. I detailed the massive medical malpractice lawsuit my lead corporate counsel Harrison Sterling was currently drafting, which would name this facility, its parent company, and Dr. Aris personally as primary defendants. I assured him that my legal team would freeze his assets, strip him of his medical license, and drag his clinic through a public relations slaughterhouse so severe they would be forced to close their doors by the end of the fiscal quarter. Dr. Aris was visibly shaking. The condescension had completely evaporated, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. He realized in a matter of minutes that the woman sitting across from him in cheap cotton scrubs was not a delusional renter throwing a tantrum. She was exactly who she claimed to be, a highly educated, wildly powerful corporate titan who had just been illegally kidnapped. He stood up so fast his metal chair scraped loudly against the floor. He grabbed the forged file, stammering a chaotic stream of profound apologies. He stated unequivocally that I did not meet a single clinical criterion for an involuntary psychiatric hold. He promised to personally expedite my discharge papers and immediately authorize the return of my clothing, my phone, and my personal effects. He moved toward the heavy door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. Before he turned the key, he stopped. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and deep, genuine dread. "Your family is trying to destroy you." The brisk Chicago wind hit my face the second I walked through the heavy glass doors of the psychiatric facility, instantly wiping away the suffocating scent of antiseptic. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and powered it back on. Dozens of notifications flooded the screen, but I ignored them all, focusing solely on the time. It was exactly 6 in the evening. In 2 hours, the Midwest Financial Vanguard Gala would commence at the Drake Hotel. It was the premier networking event for the city's elite wealth managers, including the senior partners at DeAndre's firm. I knew for an absolute fact he had secured a table months ago. He intended to use the event to rub shoulders with the upper echelon of the financial sector, desperately hoping to land a whale of a client to mask his crumbling personal finances. I hailed a private car and dialed my executive assistant. I did not waste precious time explaining the absurd medical kidnapping attempt orchestrated by my mother. I simply instructed her to have my tailor meet me at my downtown corporate suite with the midnight blue silk gown we had reserved for the Sentinel Analytics Winter Showcase. I also requested a full expedited dossier on the executives seated at DeAndre's specific table. If my family wanted to wage a war of reputations in the public arena, they were about to discover how vastly outgunned they truly were. I swapped the scratchy, humiliating cotton hospital scrubs for the tailored silk, applied a flawless layer of makeup, and armed myself for absolute corporate warfare. By 8:30, the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a glittering sea of crystal chandeliers, tailored tuxedos, and flowing champagne. DeAndre stood near the center of the room, entirely in his element. He held a crystal tumbler of expensive scotch. His posture relaxed, exuding the false confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully eliminated his greatest threat. He was surrounded by 4 senior managing directors from Wall Street, men whose approval could make or break his desperate, failing career. I glided through the ornate archways, my silk gown catching the light, moving with the absolute silence of a phantom. I blended seamlessly into the crowd of affluent socialites and high-powered executives, positioning myself just behind a towering floral arrangement near DeAndre's circle. I was close enough to smell the heavy cologne he used to mask his anxiety. DeAndre lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, feigning deep personal sorrow. I listened intently as he painted a masterpiece of absolute fiction for the captive audience of investors. He told the executives that he had been dealing with a profound family tragedy, claiming that my mind had finally snapped under the pressure of the modern world. He boldly referred to me as a psychotic college dropout who had fabricated an entire corporate empire out of thin air just to feel important. He took a slow, dramatic sip of his scotch and asserted that Vanguard Real Estate and Sentinel Analytics were nothing more than fraudulent shell companies. He spun a horrific tale claiming I was using these fake entities to systematically embezzle from our aging, defenseless parents. He played the role of the exhausted, wealthy protector perfectly. He claimed that he and Vanessa had been forced to authorize an involuntary medical hold that very afternoon, just to stop me from harming myself and completely liquidating my parents' retirement accounts. He even had the audacity to suggest that he was personally funding the legal battle to establish a conservatorship to protect my remaining assets from my own delusions. The executives murmured in sympathetic horror. They shook their heads, offering quiet condolences for the tragic tale of a delusional woman ruining a good, upstanding family. DeAndre soaked up their sympathy, his chest puffing out as he accepted their praise for being such a steadfast, reliable family man. He was building his entire professional future on the foundation of my manufactured insanity. One of the senior directors, a man named Sterling, whom I had actually outbid on a massive commercial acquisition 2 years prior, nodded grimly at DeAndre's story. Then Sterling's gaze shifted slightly over DeAndre's shoulder. His eyes widened in immediate, unmistakable recognition. He did not see a psychotic dropout or a delusional scam artist. He saw the very real, very lucid, and highly feared CEO of Sentinel Analytics standing mere feet away. The sudden chilling shift in Sterling's expression caused DeAndre to pause mid-sentence. He turned around following the executive's line of sight. The smug, sympathetic mask melted off DeAndre's face in a fraction of a second. The color drained from his cheeks so completely, he looked like a walking corpse. He stared at me, his mouth hanging slightly open, the scotch tumbling dangerously close to the rim of his shaking glass. He fully believed I was locked in a sterile, padded evaluation room for the next 72 hours, stripped of my phone and my power. Yet here I was, impeccably styled, entirely free, and commanding the silent attention of the very room he was trying to manipulate. I did not raise my voice. I did not cause a chaotic scene or loudly interrupt his pathetic lies. Causing a public spectacle was a tactic for the powerless, and I held all the cards. I simply looked him dead in the eyes, offering the cold, calculating stare of a predator acknowledging her trapped prey. I reached out and picked up a flute of champagne from a passing waiter's silver tray. I held DeAndre's terrified gaze, smiled a slow, razor-sharp smile, and raised my glass in a perfectly silent toast. DeAndre could not breathe. He stood paralyzed in front of his elite peers as the absolute certainty of his impending destruction washed over him. I took a deliberate sip of the champagne, turned gracefully on my heel, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. I had heard exactly what I needed to hear, and I had exactly what I needed to finish this. I left the hotel to arm my ultimate weapon. The frigid Chicago air bit at my bare shoulders the moment I stepped out of the Drake Hotel, but I barely felt it. My private driver was idling at the curb, the engine of the black town car, a low, steady rumble against the city noise. I slid into the leather back seat, giving him a single clipped instruction to take me to headquarters. As the car navigated through the illuminated downtown streets, I felt a profound sense of clarity. DeAndre's desperate, pathetic performance at the gala had confirmed everything I suspected. My family was not just trying to control me, they were trying to silence me before I could uncover the truth. The car pulled up to a soaring 80-story monolith of dark glass and steel. This was the physical manifestation of Sentinel Analytics. I stepped out of the vehicle, the hem of my midnight blue silk gown sweeping across the pristine concrete, and walked through the towering revolving doors. The lobby was a masterpiece of minimalist intimidation. There were no overly eager receptionists, no plush waiting areas designed to coddle insecure clients. There was only polished black marble and an elite, heavily armed private security detail. The shift commander stood up straight the second he saw me approach. I did not need to present an ID or state my business. I gave him a brief nod, bypassed the standard visitor checkpoints, and walked directly to the private executive elevator bank. I pressed my hand against the biometric scanner. A thin red laser swept across my palm, reading my unique vascular pattern, while a hidden camera authorized my retinal signature. The heavy steel doors slid open with a soft hiss. I stepped inside entirely alone, and the elevator rocketed upward to the 42nd floor. When the doors parted, I stepped into the absolute nerve center of my empire. The main operations floor of Sentinel Analytics was vast, dimly lit, and breathtakingly advanced. It looked less like a traditional corporate office and more like a military command center. Rows of curved, high-definition monitors glowed with streams of complex real-time data. The air was kept impeccably cool, humming with the relentless, quiet power of the massive server banks housed in the adjoining glass enclosures. This was the entity my father Richard had once casually dismissed as a cute little tech hobby. He had scoffed at my algorithms, calling my work petty bookkeeping, designed for people who lacked the stomach for real aggressive finance. He believed wealth was built on handshakes, golf course deals, and intimidation. He was completely blind to the fact that the modern world ran on data, and I owned the absolute best data interpretation engine on the planet. My chief technology officer, David, was standing at the center of the room. He was a brilliant, relentlessly focused engineer who rarely slept and never asked unnecessary questions. He was flanked by 3 of my senior data analysts. They were all staring intently at the massive digital display that dominated the entire front wall of the operations floor. David turned as I approached. He did not bat an eye at the fact that his CEO was walking through a sterile server room wearing a trailing couture evening gown. He simply handed me a secure encrypted tablet. I asked for a status report. David kept his voice low, his tone vibrating with suppressed adrenaline. He informed me that the proprietary deep dive algorithm I had initiated just hours prior had been running continuously at maximum processing capacity. I had instructed Sentinel's artificial intelligence to execute a total unrestricted cross-reference of every single financial footprint associated with my family. The parameters were ruthless. The AI was currently tearing through publicly filed tax returns, obscure offshore wire transfers, encrypted holding companies' property deeds, and shadow ledgers. It was specifically targeting the intersection between DeAndre's supposedly elite hedge fund and Richard's decades-old wealth management firm. David tapped the screen of the tablet, transferring the visual feed to the massive wall monitor. He explained that the architecture of their combined finances was staggering not in its wealth, but in its sheer, terrifying fragility. He pointed to a complex web of intersecting lines on the screen. My father and my brother-in-law had built a labyrinth of highly leveraged margin accounts and dummy corporations. They were executing an aggressive, desperate loop of capital moving money back and forth between their respective firms to simulate liquidity and inflate their quarterly earnings reports. They were using ghost assets to secure massive loans, then using those loans to pay off older, aggressively compounding debts. It was a financial house of cards held together by arrogance and fraudulent paperwork. I stood perfectly still, watching the progress bar on the main screen hover at 99%. Millions of data points were being sorted, categorized, and weaponized in a matter of seconds. Sentinel was doing exactly what I had designed it to do. It was hunting for the anomalies that human auditors were specifically paid to ignore. The progress bar hit 100%. It vanished from the screen. For a fraction of a second, the sprawling operations floor plunged into absolute breathless silence. The steady stream of blue and white data numbers stopped flowing. Then the massive digital screens spanning the length of the wall violently shifted. The ambient lighting in the room snapped from a cool clinical blue to a glaring pulsing red. The sudden shift bathed the entire room in the color of a critical catastrophic system alert. The AI had successfully isolated the core discrepancy. It had sliced through the layers of fake corporate entities and matched the incoming investments against the outgoing ghost transfers. It pulled the raw, unmanipulated data from Richard's firm and DeAndre's fund, merging them into a single, undeniable conclusion. David took a step back from the console, his eyes wide as he stared up at the glaring red numbers projected on the wall. He swallowed hard, his voice hushed with absolute disbelief. He read the final number aloud, ensuring the calculation was perfectly clear. There was a massive gaping deficit sitting at the very center of their shared financial structure. The AI had not found a rounding error or a minor clerical mistake. It had found exactly $5 million entirely missing from their combined accounts. The money had simply vanished, swallowed by their desperate attempts to cover their tracks. It was undeniable, legally binding proof of a massive, coordinated fraud, and I finally had the weapon to burn their empire to ash. The glaring red light from the massive digital monitors bathed the operations floor in an ominous, bloody hue. $5 million. It was not a rounding error. It was not a miscalculation hidden in the margins of a complex tax return. It was a gaping, bleeding arterial wound in the very center of Richard's wealth management firm and DeAndre's hedge fund. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of their stupidity wash over me. David remained frozen beside the primary console, his eyes darting between the fluctuating data streams. I ordered David to run a trace on the exact outflow vectors. Money does not simply evaporate into the digital ether. It leaves a trail. I needed to know exactly where that $5 million had gone over the past 36 months. David's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. The massive central screen fragmented into dozens of smaller windows, rapidly pulling unredacted wire transfers, offshore routing numbers, and highly classified purchase orders. The AI ripped through the heavily encrypted firewalls DeAndre had foolishly believed would protect him. The red numbers began to translate into physical assets. I watched my expression turning to ice as the itemized list of their embezzlement populated before my eyes. The Aspen property. A $2 million down payment on a luxury ski chalet registered under a blind LLC that traced directly back to Vanessa's maiden name. The wedding. $500,000 funneled through phantom vendor invoices to pay for Vanessa and DeAndre's extravagant magazine-featured wedding ceremony. The lifestyle maintenance. Hundreds of thousands of dollars bleeding out monthly to cover private jet charters, custom jewelry, purebred horses, and high-end interior designers. Vanessa's entire existence was a carefully curated, heavily filtered lie. She was not the wealthy, successful socialite she pretended to be. Her flawless life, her sprawling mansion, and her pristine reputation were completely funded by stolen capital. Richard and DeAndre had been quietly siphoning funds from their oldest, most trusting clients, transferring the money through dummy accounts to maintain the golden child's illusion of perfection. But thieves only resort to kidnapping when they are cornered. The fraudulent psychiatric, hold the expedited medical conservatorship, the sheer panicked rush of my mother showing up at my building with the police. None of it made sense for a simple family grudge. There had to be a ticking clock. I instructed David to execute a cross-reference search on federal regulatory schedules. I needed to see the compliance calendar for both firms. The screen blinked, pulling data from the Securities and Exchange Commission's public filing registry. A single glaring date highlighted in neon yellow appeared at the center of the display. Next Friday. The SEC had initiated a mandatory comprehensive forensic audit of DeAndre's hedge fund. The final pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with deafening clarity. I let out a low, humorless laugh that echoed across the silent server room. They did not give a single damn about my mental health. They did not actually believe I was delusional. And they certainly were not content with merely stealing the $300,000 inheritance my grandfather had left me. That was never going to be enough to save them. They needed every single asset I possessed. In their arrogant, narrow minds, they still believed I was a struggling college dropout who had somehow stumbled into a minor tech success. They assumed I had a healthy bank account, a moderately valuable business, and perhaps some decent liquid assets. Their plan was brutal in its simplicity. They intended to lock me in a psychiatric ward, use the 72-hour window to establish emergency control over my finances via the conservatorship, and immediately liquidate everything I owned. They were going to drain my personal savings, sell off whatever they thought my company was worth, and use my money to patch the $5 million hole before the federal auditors walked through their doors next Friday. If they failed to balance their ledgers, the SEC would discover the missing client funds. Richard would lose his firm and his license. DeAndre would be stripped of his credentials. Both men would be indicted for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. They were staring down the barrel of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. My family was not trying to put me in a cage to protect me. They were trying to throw me into a cage so I could serve as their financial human shield. David turned to me, his hands resting over the keyboard. He asked if he should compile the data packets and forward the evidence directly to the FBI Cybercrimes Division or alert the SEC auditors ahead of schedule. I looked at the glowing red screen my reflection caught in the dark glass. Exposing them now would be entirely too easy. Handing this over to the authorities would result in a swift arrest, a quiet plea deal, and a neat, tidy resolution. They would go to prison, but they would do it believing they were victims of bad luck. They would never truly understand the magnitude of the predator they had tried to corner. I told David to hold the files. I instructed him to access a specific heavily monitored decoy account I kept active for Sentinel's penetration testing. It was a honeypot account designed to look like a massive, vulnerable pool of liquid cash, entirely untraceable and fully accessible to anyone with the right administrative override. I ordered David to manipulate the digital breadcrumbs, ensuring that when DeAndre inevitably attempted to hack into my personal finances to seize my assets, he would find this exact account sitting right in the open. I was not going to push them off the cliff. I was going to open the door, lay out a red carpet, and let them sprint willingly into a federal trap of their own making. Once they initiated a wire transfer from that decoy account, they would be committing the final irreversible felony across state lines, triggering a mandatory minimum sentence that no highly paid defense attorney could ever negotiate away. I smiled, the blue light of the servers catching my eyes. I told David to prime the trap and leave the bait. It was time to let my family think they had finally won. I left the humming server banks of Sentinel Analytics behind and began my physical transformation. If Richard and Patricia needed a broken, hysterical woman to justify their fraudulent conservatorship, I was going to give them an absolute masterpiece of a performance. I instructed my driver to take me back to my apartment. I stripped off the midnight blue silk gown and threw it carelessly onto the bed. I needed to look exactly like a woman whose spirit had been entirely crushed by a terrifying 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. I washed my face with harsh soap, rubbing my eyes violently until the sclera were bloodshot and raw. I pulled a faded, oversized gray sweater from the back of my closet and paired it with wrinkled leggings. I brushed my hair haphazardly, leaving it tangled and flat against my skull. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The ruthless, calculating CEO was gone. In her place stood a terrified, fragile victim teetering on the very edge of a total psychological collapse. It was time to go to work. The journey to my parents' sprawling suburban estate took 40 long minutes. I used every single second of that drive to prepare my body for the deception. I hyperventilated slightly, forcing my physiology into a state of genuine distress. I wanted my hands to tremble uncontrollably. I wanted my breathing to remain shallow, erratic, and panic-stricken. The iron gates of my childhood home swung open, revealing the massive, meticulously manicured grounds. Every blade of grass, every towering oak tree, every perfectly placed landscape light was paid for with stolen money. Every Persian rug inside every original oil painting hanging on the walls, every crystal chandelier illuminating the foyer was a complete lie. They had built a monument to their own greed, using the life savings of people who trusted them. They were living like royalty on embezzled client funds while pointing fingers at me. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of their existence fueled my focus. I walked up the long, sweeping driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my cheap sneakers. The towering mahogany front doors loomed ahead. I did not ring the heavy brass bell. I knocked softly, weakly, letting my shoulders slump forward, as if I could no longer bear the weight of my own existence. The door clicked open. Patricia stood in the grand entryway. She was dressed impeccably in a beige cashmere twin set and a string of flawless pearls, presenting a stark, calculated contrast to my pathetic, disheveled state. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second as she registered my appearance. A flicker of absolute, unadulterated triumph crossed her face. She had won, or so she believed. She quickly masked her victory with a look of manufactured maternal concern. I did not wait for her to speak. I let out a choked, desperate sob and pitched forward, forcing her to catch my weight. She wrapped her arms around me, murmuring soothing, hollow words of comfort. The house smelled of expensive floral arrangements and sharp lemon polish. It smelled exactly like my childhood, a cold, sterile place where I was never quite good enough, never quite smart enough, never quite the golden child Vanessa was. Patricia guided me into the formal living room and eased me onto the plush velvet sofa. I buried my face in my trembling hands, letting my shoulders heave with fabricated despair. I told her the evaluation facility was a waking nightmare. I described the cold, sterile rooms, the terrifying doctors, the sheer isolation that had supposedly stripped away the last remnants of my sanity. I kept my voice weak, disjointed, and entirely devoid of the sharp, commanding authority I had wielded just hours ago in my server room. I babbled incoherently about losing my grip on reality, selling the lie that the pressure of the corporate world had finally fractured my mind. Patricia sat quietly drinking in every single word, entirely convinced that her brilliant ambush had successfully broken her problematic daughter. I slowly looked up at her, my eyes streaming with real forced tears. I begged her for mercy. I explained that my accounts were inexplicably frozen, my credit cards were declining at the grocery store, and my entire life was rapidly falling apart. I pleaded for a fraction of my own money. I begged her to just give me the $45,000 they had drained from my secondary accounts so I could pay my immediate bills and keep a roof over my head. I made myself sound desperate, pathetic, and utterly dependent on her goodwill. I clasped my hands together, looking at her with the wide, terrified eyes of a trapped animal. Patricia shifted closer on the velvet cushions. She reached out and began to stroke my tangled hair. Her touch was sickening, completely devoid of any genuine warmth, yet she played the role of the loving, protective mother to absolute perfection. She offered a soft, condescending sigh that echoed through the quiet room. She told me that I was clearly not well, that the stress had taken a devastating toll on my health. She spoke in that patronizing, syrupy tone she always used when she believed she held all the power. Patricia leaned in close, the scent of her heavy perfume suffocating me. She whispered that the family was here to protect me from myself. She delivered her final damning ultimatum perfectly. Just sign the conservatorship papers, sweetie. Let the men handle the money. We will take care of you. Internally, my mind was sharp, calculating, and entirely victorious. They were walking blindly into the trap. The honeypot account awaited them, filled with digital bait they could not resist. The federal auditors were already circling their fraudulent empire, and they were about to hand me the very mechanism of their destruction. Externally, however, I crumbled completely. I nodded slowly, letting fresh tears spill down my cheeks and onto my collar. I told her I was so incredibly tired of fighting. I told her the paranoia was too heavy to carry anymore. I confessed that I just wanted the nightmare to end, that I trusted her and Richard to fix the catastrophic mess I had supposedly made of my life. I promised to surrender. I tearfully agreed to attend the official pre-trial mediation the very next morning at their high-rise legal offices. I gave her my absolute, unwavering word that I would sign the conservatorship documents without a single legal objection. I would hand over full, uncontested control of all my corporate and personal assets to Richard and DeAndre, letting them access the exact accounts they needed. Patricia smiled, a predator admiring her freshly caught prey. She gently kissed my forehead entirely, unaware that the broken woman sitting beside her was about to systematically dismantle her entire world. She believed she had just secured the $5 million they desperately needed to avoid federal prison. She had no idea she had just agreed to walk straight into a federal trap. The silence in the mediation room was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. The room was located on the 60th floor of a prestigious downtown high-rise, a fortress of legal power, designed to make whoever sat on the opposing side of the table feel entirely powerless. I sat hunched in a high-backed leather chair, wearing the same faded, oversized gray sweater from the day before, my hair pulled into a messy, defeated knot. I kept my eyes downcast, staring blankly at the polished mahogany wood grain. Across from me, the contrast was sickening. DeAndre leaned back in his chair, exuding an aura of absolute invincibility. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly. His custom Italian leather loafers were casually kicked up onto the edge of the conference table, right next to a crystal water pitcher. He kept adjusting his cuffs to flash a $50,000 watch, an accessory I now knew was purchased with the stolen retirement funds of a retired schoolteacher. Next to him sat Richard. My father looked robust, his chest puffed out with the triumphant satisfaction of a man who had successfully neutralized his only true threat. He adjusted his silk tie and offered me a look of profound, sickeningly fake pity. Their lead attorney, a gray-haired man named Harrison, sat at the head of the table. He was methodically detailing the terms of the voluntary conservatorship and the subsequent asset transfer agreement. Harrison spoke in a soothing, measured tone, explaining how my assets, my bank accounts, my properties, and the controlling shares of what they believed to be a failing little tech company would be temporarily transferred to Richard and DeAndre's management firm. Harrison claimed this was a protective measure, a way to shield my finances, while I took a much-needed indefinite leave of absence to address my severe psychiatric distress. I let my bottom lip quiver. I dug my fingernails into my palms, forcing my body to exhibit the physical symptoms of a woman completely broken by the system. I knew exactly what they were planning to do the second the ink dried on these pages. They were not going to manage my assets. They were going to liquidate everything I owned before noon. They needed the cash to cover the massive bleeding $5 million deficit in their shadow ledgers before the Securities and Exchange Commission kicked down their doors on Friday. Richard leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He lowered his voice, adopting the tone of a benevolent patriarch forgiving a wayward child. He told me that he knew the 72-hour psychiatric hold had been a terrifying experience, but it was a necessary evil. He claimed that watching me unravel had broken his and Patricia's hearts, and they were simply stepping in to do what families do. They were here to save me from my own delusions. He promised that once the money was safely under their control, I would not have to worry about a single thing ever again. I could just rest. I forced a ragged, pathetic breath into my lungs and nodded weakly, letting my shoulders collapse even further inward. DeAndre could not contain his amusement. He watched my manufactured display of submission and let out a low, mocking chuckle. He swung his feet off the mahogany table and leaned forward, grabbing the thick, stapled stack of legal documents. He slid the asset transfer agreement across the smooth surface of the table. The heavy paper came to a halt directly in front of me. DeAndre stared at me, his eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of a man who believed he had just successfully stolen my entire life. He tapped the signature line with a manicured finger. "Good girl," he sneered, his voice dropping into a harsh, condescending whisper. "Leave the finance to the adults before you hurt yourself." I kept my head bowed, hiding the cold, razor-sharp calculation burning behind my eyes. DeAndre thought he was taking my $300,000 inheritance. He thought he was taking my car and my savings. He had absolutely no idea that this document was not a surrender. It was a digital guillotine. By signing this agreement, I was legally granting him administrative access to the exact financial routing numbers David and I had primed the night before. I was giving him the keys to the Sentinel Analytics honeypot. It was a decoy account built to look like a massive unsecured offshore holding. It was loaded with phantom capital entirely untraceable and actively monitored by federal cybersecurity protocols. The absolute second DeAndre used his newly acquired conservatorship powers to initiate a wire transfer from that decoy account to his own failing hedge fund, he would be committing irrevocable federal wire fraud across state lines. He would not just be stealing. He would be triggering a mandatory minimum sentence that no highly paid attorney in Chicago could ever make disappear. I was handing them a loaded weapon and inviting them to pull the trigger. Harrison placed a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen next to the documents. I reached out. I commanded the muscles in my arm to spasm. My hand trembled so violently that my knuckles rapped against the mahogany table. I fumbled with the pen, gripping it awkwardly, as if the weight of it was simply too much to bear. I slowly raised my head and looked directly into my father's eyes. I let a thick, hot tear spill over my lashes and trace a path down my cheek, presenting the exact image of a defeated, shattered daughter begging for mercy. Then I looked down at the crisp white paper, pressed the gold nib against the signature line, and signed my name. The gold nib of the heavy fountain pen lifted from the thick parchment with a final, definitive scratch. Harrison leaned forward instantly. He snatched the asset transfer agreement across the polished mahogany table with the eagerness of a vulture quickly scanning the bottom of the final page. He offered a curt, professional nod to my father. The transaction was complete. The suffocating tension in the room shattered, replaced immediately by a wave of arrogant, victorious relief. Richard let out a massive exhale, sinking deep into his leather executive chair. The manufactured mask of the deeply concerned, grieving father vanished in a fraction of a second. In his place sat the ruthless, calculating businessman who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover of his own daughter's life. He adjusted his silk tie, his posture radiating absolute, unadulterated triumph. DeAndre let out a loud, mocking laugh that bounced off the glass walls of the conference room. He clapped his hands together, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot. He swung his custom Italian leather loafers off the table and leaned in, his eyes gleaming with greedy satisfaction. Good girl. DeAndre sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. Leave the finance to the adults before you hurt yourself. They immediately stopped looking at me. I ceased to exist as a human being in their eyes. I was nothing more than a finalized contract, a solved problem. Richard turned to Harrison, his voice brisk and commanding, ordering the attorney to initiate the asset liquidation protocols before the banking cutoff at 4 o'clock. DeAndre pulled out his phone, already opening his encrypted messaging application to alert his frantic accountants that the massive capital injection they desperately needed was secured. They were practically salivating over the phantom money they believed they now controlled. I remained seated in the high-backed chair, perfectly still, letting them bask in the warm, intoxicating glow of their perceived victory. I let them feel invincible. Then I stood up. I did not stand up like a fragile woman broken by a 72-hour psychiatric hold. I did not cower. I rolled my shoulders back, snapping my spine into perfect, rigid alignment. The violent, pathetic trembling in my hands ceased with mechanical precision. I reached up, grabbed the messy, defeated knot of hair at the base of my neck, and pulled the tie free, letting my hair fall sharply around my shoulders. I reached up and wiped the final manufactured tear from my cheek. The sudden, aggressive shift in my physical presence acted like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen directly out of the room. Richard stopped speaking mid-sentence. DeAndre's fingers froze over the screen of his smartphone. Harrison looked up from his legal pad, his brow furrowing in confusion. I looked down at the three of them. The terrified, shattered victim was completely gone. In her place stood the chief executive officer of Sentinel Analytics, and I was looking at three dead men. I locked eyes with Harrison first, my voice dropping into a cold, calibrated register that cut through the silence like a scalpel. I instructed the attorney to look at the document again. I told him to look very closely at the exact ink on the signature line. Harrison frowned, his professional arrogance wavering. He pulled the heavy parchment back toward him and adjusted his reading glasses. He stared at the ink. He stared for a long, agonizing moment as the blood slowly began to drain from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty chalk. He looked up at Richard, his voice trembling with sudden, unmasked panic. He stammered out that I had not signed my personal legal name. I stepped away from the chair and walked slowly toward the edge of the mahogany table. I looked directly at my father. I explained that I had not surrendered my personal savings. I had executed that document under the specific legally binding corporate seal of Sentinel Analytics Corporation. DeAndre stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He demanded to know what difference a corporate signature made. He shouted that they had the conservatorship, that they controlled my assets regardless of what name I used. I offered him a smile that held absolutely no warmth. I explained the fatal flaw in his agonizingly basic understanding of federal law. By forcing me to sign a personal asset transfer under the explicit threat of involuntary psychiatric commitment, they had committed a highly unethical, easily contested civil offense. But by forcing me to sign over corporate assets under severe duress, they had crossed a massive, irreversible line. They had just committed federal corporate extortion. I watched the realization hit them. I watched their arrogant empire crumble in real time. I turned my attention to DeAndre, dissecting his impending destruction with surgical precision. I informed him that the specific routing numbers attached to that transfer agreement did not lead to my personal wealth. They led directly to a decoy account I maintained for Sentinel's cybersecurity penetration testing. The account was loaded with phantom capital and actively monitored by federal oversight algorithms. I leaned over the table, planting my hands flat against the mahogany, forcing them to look at the predator they had foolishly invited into their trap. I told them that the absolute second they used their new conservatorship powers to initiate a wire transfer to cover their $5 million embezzlement, they would be committing interstate wire fraud involving defense-grade corporate assets. They had not just stolen my purse, they had attempted to rob a federally contracted data firm. They had triggered a mandatory minimum sentence that no highly paid defense attorney could ever negotiate away. Richard sat entirely paralyzed. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. DeAndre backed away from the table, his chest heaving as the sheer magnitude of his catastrophic miscalculation finally broke through his arrogance. Harrison dropped the gold-plated fountain pen as if it had suddenly caught fire, realizing his own legal license and freedom were now permanently implicated in a federal conspiracy. I did not give them a single second to respond, to beg, or to negotiate. I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the mediation room. The cheap sneakers I wore for my performance made no sound against the thick carpet, but my exit felt deafening. I strode down the long, sterile hallway toward the executive elevator bank. The suffocating, toxic air of my family's manipulation rolled off my shoulders. I pressed the call button and pulled my encrypted smartphone from the pocket of my oversized sweater. The screen glowed brightly in the dim corridor. I opened the secure Sentinel Operations application. The massive, undeniable data packet David had compiled the night before was queued up and waiting. Audit Report 404. The file contained every single unredacted transaction, every hidden offshore routing number, every piece of fabricated vendor invoicing, and the undeniable mathematical proof of their $5 million deficit. It was a digital death warrant. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The steel doors parted. I stepped inside the empty car and selected the recipients for the encrypted file. I cued the local field office of the FBI Cybercrimes and Financial Fraud Division. I added the direct secure email address of the presiding judge, who was scheduled to formally review their fraudulent conservatorship hearing the following morning. I turned around to face the hallway as the elevator doors began to slide shut. I pressed send. The metallic glide of the elevator doors shutting perfectly mirrored the heavy final thud of the solid oak doors sealing courtroom 4B the following morning. The air inside the chamber was stagnant, thick with the scent of floor wax and generations of legal precedent. This was the arena Richard and Patricia had chosen for their final victory lap. They believed they were walking into a rubber stamp proceeding, a mere formality, to validate the theft they thought they had already secured the day before in the mediation room. I sat at the respondents' table, perfectly maintaining the illusion of a defeated, shattered woman. I wore the same oversized gray sweater, my posture slumped, my hands folded limply in my lap. To the untrained eye, I was exactly what my family claimed I was: a fragile, inept college dropout who had completely lost her grip on reality. Behind me, sitting in the front row of the gallery, my family put on an Oscar-worthy performance of their own. Patricia dabbed at the corners of her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, playing the role of the devastated, loving mother. Richard sat tall and stoic, his jaw set in a mask of grim, patriarchal duty. DeAndre lounged beside them, his bespoke suit immaculate, exuding the bored impatience of a man merely waiting for a check to clear. Vanessa rested her hand on DeAndre's arm, projecting the image of a supportive sister, carrying the heavy burden of my supposed insanity. Harrison, their lead attorney, stood at the podium facing the judge's bench. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and launched into his prepared monologue with sickeningly practiced empathy. He spoke in soft, measured tones, weaponizing his fake compassion to paint a devastating picture of my life. He told the court that it broke his clients' hearts to be here today. He described my parents as tireless, devoted caretakers who had exhausted every possible avenue to help their deeply troubled daughter. He recounted the events of the past week, citing the 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold as undeniable proof of my catastrophic mental decline. He wove a brilliant fictional narrative of a young woman who could simply not handle the pressures of adulthood, a woman prone to wild paranoid delusions of grandeur and extreme financial irresponsibility. The presiding judge, a stern-faced man with a reputation for swift efficiency, listened quietly from his elevated bench. He peered over his reading glasses, his gaze occasionally dropping to the thick stack of printed documents Harrison had provided. Harrison then smoothly transitioned to the financial disclosure portion of the hearing. He needed the court to view my assets as meager and mismanaged, requiring immediate adult supervision. He approached the bench, handing over a highly redacted, completely fabricated inventory of my net worth. He listed my assets aloud for the public record, his voice dripping with patronizing pity. He began with my vehicle, noting it as a standard 5-year-old sedan of unremarkable value. He then moved to my liquid capital. He dramatically announced the sum of $45,000 sitting in a secondary checking account. He entirely omitted the fact that Richard and DeAndre had already illegally drained those exact funds during my involuntary hold. Instead, Harrison presented the money as a fragile safety net that my parents had graciously stepped in to manage before I could recklessly squander it. Finally, he brought up the inheritance. Harrison spoke of the $300,000 my grandfather had left me, framing it as a sacred family gift that was in imminent danger of being lost to my supposed manic episodes. He painted a portrait of a woman who possessed just enough money to be a danger to herself, a woman absolutely desperate for the financial guardianship only her loving parents could provide. I sat motionless, letting the sheer audacity of their lies wash over me. Harrison was presenting me as a financial toddler, a dependent incapable of balancing a basic checkbook. He had absolutely no idea that the woman sitting 10 feet behind him was the chief executive officer of a data analytics firm handling defense-grade government contracts. He did not know about Sentinel Analytics. He did not know about the millions of dollars in highly classified corporate assets I controlled. And he certainly did not know about Audit Report 404, the massive encrypted file I had sent directly to the FBI and to the private inbox of the very judge sitting before him. Harrison concluded his argument with a theatrical sigh of resignation. He asked the court to grant Richard and DeAndre full permanent financial and medical conservatorship. He implored the judge to validate the asset transfer agreement I had signed the previous day, requesting immediate authorization to transfer all of my listed accounts into DeAndre's hedge fund for safekeeping. It was a flawlessly executed performance. Richard nodded solemnly. Patricia let out a quiet, manufactured sob. DeAndre checked his watch, anticipating the immediate wire transfer that would save him from federal indictment. The judge gathered the paperwork, tapping the edges against his heavy wooden desk to align the pages. He looked down at the proposed conservatorship order. He reached for his pen. The room held its collective breath. Richard leaned forward, his eyes locked on the judge's hand, waiting for the final stroke of ink that would legalize their $5 million embezzlement. They thought they had won. They thought the game was over. Suddenly, the heavy wooden gate separating the gallery from the courtroom floor swung open with a sharp, undeniable crack. The noise shattered the oppressive silence, drawing every eye in the room. A man stepped onto the floor. He was not a public defender, and he was certainly not a family friend. He was dressed in a razor-sharp midnight blue Tom Ford suit, radiating an aura of absolute terrifying authority. He bypassed the gallery entirely and strode directly to the respondent's table, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. He did not look at Richard. He did not acknowledge Harrison. He looked directly up at the judge. With deliberate, precise movements, he unzipped a thick, heavily reinforced black leather briefcase. The metallic sound of the zipper cut through the dead air of the courtroom. The side of the briefcase bore a subtle embossed insignia that sent an immediate physical shockwave through Harrison and DeAndre. It was a federally sealed corporate litigation carrier. My attorney reached inside and pulled out a stack of documents bound in federal red tape. He slammed them down onto the table with a deafening thud, completely hijacking the proceedings. The deafening thud of the bound documents hitting the polished wood of the respondent's table froze the entire courtroom. Judge Ramirez halted his pen, hovering mere millimeters above the signature line of the conservatorship decree. He looked up, his brow furrowed in severe displeasure at the sudden interruption. "Your Honor," the man in the midnight blue suit announced, his voice projecting with the effortless volume of a seasoned litigator. "Marcus Sterling, I am the lead corporate counsel representing Sentinel Analytics Corporation, and I am here serving as personal counsel for its sole founder and chief executive officer, the woman sitting beside me." Harrison blinked, his mouth dropping open in a rare display of complete bewilderment. He looked at me, then at Sterling, trying to reconcile the image of the broken woman he had just spent 20 minutes dissecting with the presence of a high-powered corporate litigator. Judge Ramirez set his pen down slowly. Mr. Sterling, this is a closed family conservatorship hearing regarding a private citizen. You are interrupting a highly sensitive medical and financial proceeding. I am interrupting a meticulously orchestrated federal crime, Your Honor, Sterling corrected without missing a single beat. He picked up the heavy stack of documents he had just slammed onto the table. Opposing counsel has just presented this court with a financial disclosure form that is not merely inaccurate. It is a fabricated, fraudulent instrument designed to facilitate the theft of classified corporate assets under the guise of a domestic guardianship. A collective gasp rippled through the front row of the gallery. Patricia gripped the back of the wooden bench in front of her. Richard sat bolt upright, his face flashing from stoic confidence to sudden defensive anger. DeAndre scoffed, shifting in his seat entirely convinced this was a desperate dramatic bluff. Sterling did not wait for permission. He approached the bench with measured, deliberate strides. He held out the thick, federally sealed portfolio. I am submitting for the court's immediate review the true, unredacted, and IRS-authenticated financial portfolio of my client, Sterling stated, placing the heavy binder directly in front of the judge. This portfolio includes fully audited returns, verified corporate holding statements, and active federal defense contract ledgers. It will demonstrate unequivocally that the petition before you is an act of malicious perjury. Harrison scrambled to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous ambush. My clients are simply trying to protect their mentally unstable daughter. This man is making baseless, slanderous accusations. I will be the judge of what is baseless, counselor, Judge Ramirez snapped, holding up a hand to silence Harrison. The judge adjusted his reading glasses, his demeanor shifting from annoyed to intensely focused. He picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the thick red federal security tape binding the portfolio. The courtroom descended into absolute suffocating silence. The only sound was the heavy, crisp rustle of thick parchment paper as Judge Ramirez turned the first page. His eyes scanned the executive summary. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched his posture straighten as the sheer magnitude of the numbers registered in his mind. He looked up at me, his eyes widening with a profound, unmasked shock, before returning his gaze to the certified documents. Mr. Harrison, Judge Ramirez said, his voice dropping an octave, echoing with a dangerous, quiet authority. You stood before this court 10 minutes ago and swore under penalty of perjury that your client's daughter possessed a total net worth of approximately $345,000. That is correct, Your Honor, Harrison replied, his voice losing its previously smooth confidence. Based on the exhaustive financial digging my clients have conducted. Judge Ramirez did not look at him. He kept his eyes glued to the IRS certification seals. Then your clients have committed a spectacular act of perjury, and you have blindly delivered it to my bench, Judge Ramirez stated coldly. He picked up the document, holding it so the entire room could see the official federal watermarks catching the light. He began to read aloud, his voice booming through the cavernous room. Authenticated personal and corporate net worth, $85 million. Sole founder and chief executive officer of Sentinel Analytics Corporation. Majority shareholder of Vanguard Real Estate Holdings. Sole proprietor of the offshore cybersecurity firm Aegis Digital. The number hit the room like a physical shockwave. Behind me, I heard a sharp, choking sound. It was Patricia, literally gasping for air as if the wind had been punched out of her lungs. Judge Ramirez lowered the paper, staring directly at Richard and DeAndre. This portfolio details active classified contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It details a woman who commands an international workforce of over 400 employees. It details a financial titan, not a fragile dependent. I slowly turned my head to look at the gallery. The transformation was absolute and terrifying to witness. The color had violently, completely drained from DeAndre's face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His smug, arrogant posture had collapsed. He was gripping his knees, his eyes wide and panicked, staring at me as if I had just morphed into a monster. He realized the fatal error he had made the day before. He had taken the bait. He had used the conservatorship document to initiate a wire transfer from the Sentinel decoy account. He now knew with absolute certainty that he had not stolen $45,000 from a helpless girl. He had committed federal wire fraud against an $85 million defense contractor. Richard looked like he was having a stroke. His mouth hung open, his hands trembling uncontrollably in his lap. The patriarchal power he had wielded like a weapon his entire life was completely gone, shattered by a string of numbers he could not even begin to comprehend. He had spent his life stealing pennies from middle-class clients, and he had just tried to con a woman who could buy and sell his entire existence before breakfast. Vanessa sat frozen, her manicured hands covering her mouth. She let out a loud, high-pitched gasp, her eyes darting frantically between my oversized thrift store sweater and the lethal corporate attorney standing beside me. The realization hit her with brutal force. The sister she had mocked, the sister she had deemed a pathetic failure, was a corporate giant. Harrison collapsed back into his chair, dropping his head into his hands. He knew his career was over. He had presented fraudulent documents to a judge in an attempt to seize control of federal defense assets. He was looking at disbarment and likely prison time. They had walked into this courtroom believing they were apex predators cornering a wounded animal. They had spent days torturing me, humiliating me, and systematically attempting to strip away my freedom and my dignity. They thought they had outsmarted me. Instead, they realized they had walked blindly into a meticulously constructed, federally monitored trap. They had not bullied a helpless, unstable girl. They had attempted to illegally con a multi-million-dollar corporate entity, and they had left a perfectly documented paper trail of their crimes sitting right on the judge's desk. The suffocating silence in courtroom 4B was broken only by the sharp, crisp sound of Judge Ramirez turning the page. He did not look up at the shattered faces of my family. He did not acknowledge Harrison's panicked, ragged breathing. His eyes were entirely locked on the second half of the portfolio Marcus Sterling had provided. Sterling stood rigidly at attention, his voice projecting flawlessly across the room. He directed the court's attention to tab 2, formally labeled Audit Report 404. He stated for the record that this was a complete, unredacted forensic financial analysis executed by Sentinel Analytics and flagged for immediate federal review. Judge Ramirez adjusted his glasses. He traced his finger down the first column of the audit. The deepening scowl on his face signaled that the $85 million net worth was no longer the most shocking piece of information in the room. The judge began to read aloud, his voice stripped of all judicial neutrality, replaced by a cold, sharp disbelief. He read the names of the dummy corporations first. He listed Apex Horizon Holdings, a shell company registered in Delaware. He listed Verity Trust, a phantom entity operating out of the Cayman Islands. He rattled off a series of 12-digit offshore routing numbers, each one corresponding to a hidden, untaxed account. With every syllable the judge spoke, Richard shrank further into his chair. The patriarch of the family, the man who had demanded absolute obedience and projected flawless financial superiority, was physically trembling. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table, desperately trying to anchor himself as his entire secret empire was laid bare on the public record. Judge Ramirez continued down the page, his voice rising in volume. He read the ledger of stolen assets. He detailed the exact calculated diversion of funds from their clients. He read the names of retired school teachers, small business owners, and union pension funds. He read the precise dates and timestamps of unauthorized withdrawals, charting a clear, undeniable pattern of systematic theft. Then the judge hit the final devastating sum. He slammed his hand flat against the heavy oak desk, the impact echoing sharply. He announced the total deficit, $5,432,000. That was the exact amount missing from the accounts managed by Richard and DeAndre's firm. DeAndre could no longer maintain his seat. The sheer panic overrode his carefully curated arrogance. He bolted upright, his custom leather chair tipping backward and crashing heavily to the floor. He began to stammer, his voice pitching high with desperation. He frantically told the judge that these documents were fabricated, that this was a vicious, calculated smear campaign perpetrated by a deeply unwell woman. He pleaded with Harrison to object, to shut the proceeding down, to get the documents sealed immediately. Marcus Sterling did not even look at DeAndre. He simply stated to the judge that Audit Report 404 was hard-coded with verified banking timestamps. He explained that the data was authenticated through federal cybersecurity protocols and that it was mathematically impossible to fabricate. Harrison remained entirely mute. The lead attorney was slumped forward, staring blankly at the grain of the wood table. He recognized a federal trap when he saw one, and he knew that opening his mouth now would only guarantee his inclusion in the impending indictment. Vanessa let out a sharp, breathless whimper. She scrambled backward on the gallery bench, physically distancing herself from her father and DeAndre. The illusion of her wealthy, untouchable family had instantly evaporated, replaced by the terrifying reality of federal prison. Judge Ramirez stopped reading. He looked down at the original asset transfer agreement that Harrison had practically begged him to sign just 15 minutes prior. He looked at the specific banking routing number DeAndre had provided to receive my supposedly meager life savings. The judge slowly looked back at Audit Report 404. He compared the numbers. The destination account listed on the conservatorship transfer was the exact same offshore account, currently bleeding a $5 million deficit. The realization hit the bench with the force of a freight train. The judge lowered the documents, his face contorted, twisting from judicial shock into a mask of sheer, unadulterated fury. His eyes locked onto Richard and DeAndre, boring into them with a lethal intensity. Judge Ramirez articulated their entire scheme for the public record, his voice shaking with absolute rage. He laid out exactly what they had done. They had not come to this courtroom out of parental concern. They had not come here to protect a vulnerable daughter from her own mental decline. They had come to his courtroom because they were facing a catastrophic financial collapse and an inevitable audit by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They had orchestrated a malicious, involuntary psychiatric hold to break my spirit. They had falsified medical records, lied under oath, and weaponized the legal system to force a conservatorship. Their ultimate goal was to quickly and quietly liquidate my assets, funnel the cash into their failing shell company, and backfill the $5 million hole they had dug by stealing from innocent clients. They had attempted to use a judge's signature as the final legal shield for their federal crimes. Richard finally found his voice. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He stammered that it was a misunderstanding, a temporary reallocation of funds, a family matter that could be sorted out privately. He begged the judge to simply dismiss the petition and let them walk away. DeAndre took a sudden, panicked step backward toward the center aisle. He grabbed his phone, muttering frantically that he needed to make a call, that he needed to contact his private broker immediately. He turned his back on the bench, taking another hurried step toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. Judge Ramirez did not tolerate the disrespect. The absolute audacity of these men attempting to use his courtroom, his gavel, and his legal authority to facilitate a federal cover-up pushed him entirely over the edge. He reached out and grabbed his heavy wooden gavel. He raised it high above his head. He slammed it down against the sounding block with bone-jarring, violent force. The sound cracked through the stale air of the courtroom, echoing off the high ceilings like a gunshot. Bailiff, locked those doors immediately. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom slammed shut with a definitive echoing boom. The bailiff planted his boots firmly in front of the exit, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. The heavy brass deadbolts engaged with a sharp metallic snap. DeAndre stopped dead in his tracks. His escape route was instantly eliminated. He spun around, his chest heaving under his bespoke suit, his eyes darting frantically across the room like a trapped animal searching for a weakness in a cage. There was none. Before he could even process his trapped state, the paneled wooden doors leading directly to Judge Ramirez's private chambers flew open. A synchronized wall of tactical Navy windbreakers poured into the courtroom. 6 federal agents from the FBI Cybercrimes and Financial Fraud Division flooded the floor, moving with terrifying, silent efficiency. DeAndre raised his hands, stumbling backward, his polished, arrogant demeanor completely dissolved into raw, unfiltered panic. He shouted that there was a massive mistake. He screamed that he was a licensed hedge fund manager, that he demanded the immediate right to call his firm, that he possessed legal immunity. An agent twice his size did not bother listening to a single word. The agent lunged forward, grabbing DeAndre firmly by the lapels of his custom Italian jacket. He spun the finance executive around with brutal force and slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany of the respondent's table. The sound of DeAndre's skull impacting the wood cracked sharply through the air. Silver handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting deep into his skin as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The arresting officer leaned down, pressing his weight into DeAndre's shoulders. His voice carried clearly across the silent room, reciting a devastating, methodical litany of federal charges. DeAndre Vance, you are under arrest for federal corporate extortion, interstate wire fraud, grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud the United States government. You have the right to remain silent. Beside him, Richard did not fight. My father, the man who had spent a lifetime projecting an aura of untouchable patriarchal supremacy, completely surrendered to gravity. His legs gave out from underneath him. Two agents caught him by the arms before his knees hit the floor, dragging him back upright and securing his hands behind his back in a swift, mechanical motion. Richard's face was entirely devoid of color, his skin a sickly translucent white. His jaw hung slack. The phantom empire he had built on lies, manipulation, and stolen pension funds collapsed in the span of 30 seconds. He looked incredibly small. He looked old. He looked utterly defeated. The metallic clicks of the handcuffs triggered a chain reaction of absolute hysteria in the gallery. Vanessa stood up, her perfectly manicured hands gripping her own hair. She stared at her husband pinned against the table and treated like a common street criminal. The truth crashed down on her with the suffocating force of an anvil. She realized the lavish lifestyle she had relentlessly flaunted was entirely funded by stolen money. The luxury cars, the massive suburban estate, the endless shopping sprees, the elite private schools for her phantom future children, all of it was bought with embezzled capital. Money that was now flagged frozen and seized by federal authorities. Vanessa let out a blood-curdling shriek. It was not a performative, delicate cry designed for sympathy. It was a guttural scream of absolute ruin. She clawed at her own face, her knees buckling beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard courtroom floor, thrashing against the wooden pews. She shrieked that her bank accounts were locked. She wailed that her platinum credit cards had been declining all morning. She babbled hysterically about the notice of foreclosure currently taped to her front door. She realized she was completely bankrupt, facing immediate and highly public eviction, and her husband was heading to a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. The untouchable golden child was entirely destitute. Harrison, the arrogant attorney who had stood at the podium just minutes prior, demanding my permanent psychiatric confinement, backed slowly away from the table. He pressed himself flat against the courtroom wall, his hands raised high in surrender. He was desperately trying to visually separate himself from his criminal clients. One of the agents broke away from Richard, stepped directly into Harrison's personal space, and informed him that the State Bar Association and the federal prosecutor were currently waiting for him downstairs. Harrison squeezed his eyes shut, hyperventilating, as his lucrative decades-long career evaporated into thin air. And then there was Patricia. My mother sat paralyzed in the front row of the gallery. The sheer velocity of the shock had temporarily frozen her vocal cords. She watched her husband being read his Miranda rights. She watched her son-in-law bleeding slightly onto a legal pad. She watched her favored daughter writhing on the floor in a puddle of her own tears. The reality of her new existence settled deep into her bones. The exclusive country club memberships, the catered dinners, the arrogant superiority she wielded like a weapon against anyone she deemed beneath her were permanently gone. She was the wife of a disgraced felon. She was penniless. Her social standing was utterly obliterated. She looked at me. I was still standing beside Marcus Sterling. My spine was perfectly straight, my posture rigid, my expression completely impassive. I was no longer the punching bag. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the billionaire chief executive officer they had foolishly tried to destroy. I was their only remaining lifeline. The facade of the proud, wealthy matriarch completely shattered. Patricia scrambled out of the gallery pew. She tripped over her own feet, falling heavily to the floor. Her expensive designer skirt tore against the sharp corner of a wooden bench. She did not care. She abandoned every ounce of her pride, getting down on her hands and knees. She crawled. She literally crawled across the dirty courtroom carpet, dragging herself toward the low wooden barrier that separated the public gallery from the courtroom floor. She reached the swinging gate, grabbing the wooden railing with trembling, desperate hands. She pulled herself up just enough to look over the top of the bar. Her face was streaked with running black mascara. Her perfectly styled hair was a messy, chaotic tangle. She fell heavily to her knees against the barrier, gripping the wood so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. Tears poured down her face in a pathetic, unrestrained river. She stared up at me, her eyes wide with sheer animalistic terror. "Gwen, please!" she screamed, her voice breaking into a ragged, desperate sob that echoed over the heavy boots of the federal agents. Please, you are my daughter. Save us. I looked down at the woman who had happily handed me over to a psychiatric ward to steal my life. I watched the tears streaming down her ruined face. I adjusted the cuffs of my oversized sweater, offered her a slow, chillingly empty smile, and did not say a single word. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom slammed shut with a definitive echoing boom. The bailiff planted his boots firmly in front of the exit, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. The heavy brass deadbolts engaged with a sharp metallic snap. DeAndre stopped dead in his tracks. His escape route was instantly eliminated. He spun around his chest, heaving under his bespoke suit, his eyes darting frantically across the room like a trapped animal searching for a weakness in a cage. There was none. Before he could even process his trapped state, the paneled wooden doors leading directly to Judge Ramirez's private chambers flew open. A synchronized wall of tactical Navy windbreakers poured into the courtroom. 6 federal agents from the FBI Cybercrimes and Financial Fraud Division flooded the floor, moving with terrifying, silent efficiency. DeAndre raised his hands, stumbling backward. His polished, arrogant demeanor completely dissolved into raw, unfiltered panic. He shouted that there was a massive mistake. He screamed that he was a licensed hedge fund manager, that he demanded the immediate right to call his firm, that he possessed legal immunity. An agent twice his size did not bother listening to a single word. The agent lunged forward, grabbing DeAndre firmly by the lapels of his custom Italian jacket. He spun the finance executive around with brutal force and slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany of the respondent's table. The sound of DeAndre's skull impacting the wood cracked sharply through the air. Silver handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting deep into his skin as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The arresting officer leaned down, pressing his weight into DeAndre's shoulders. His voice carried clearly across the silent room, reciting a devastating methodical litany of federal charges. DeAndre Vance, you are under arrest for federal corporate extortion, interstate wire fraud, grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud the United States government. You have the right to remain silent. Beside him, Richard did not fight. My father, the man who had spent a lifetime projecting an aura of untouchable patriarchal supremacy, completely surrendered to gravity. His legs gave out from underneath him. 2 agents caught him by the arms before his knees hit the floor, dragging him back upright and securing his hands behind his back in a swift mechanical motion. Richard's face was entirely devoid of color, his skin a sickly translucent white. His jaw hung slack. The phantom empire he had built on lies, manipulation, and stolen pension funds collapsed in the span of 30 seconds. He looked incredibly small. He looked old. He looked utterly defeated. The metallic clicks of the handcuffs triggered a chain reaction of absolute hysteria in the gallery. Vanessa stood up, her perfectly manicured hands gripping her own hair. She stared at her husband pinned against the table and treated like a common street criminal. The truth crashed down on her with the suffocating force of an anvil. She realized the lavish lifestyle she had relentlessly flaunted was entirely funded by stolen money. The luxury cars, the massive suburban estate, the endless shopping sprees, the elite private schools for her phantom future children, all of it was bought with embezzled capital. Money that was now flagged, frozen, and seized by federal authorities. Vanessa let out a blood-curdling shriek. It was not a performative, delicate cry designed for sympathy. It was a guttural scream of absolute ruin. She clawed at her own face, her knees buckling beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard courtroom floor, thrashing against the wooden pews. She shrieked that her bank accounts were locked. She wailed that her platinum credit cards had been declining all morning. She babbled hysterically about the notice of foreclosure currently taped to her front door. She realized she was completely bankrupt, facing immediate and highly public eviction, and her husband was heading to a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. The untouchable golden child was entirely destitute. Harrison, the arrogant attorney who had stood at the podium just minutes prior, demanding my permanent psychiatric confinement, backed slowly away from the table. He pressed himself flat against the courtroom wall, his hands raised high in surrender. He was desperately trying to visually separate himself from his criminal clients. One of the agents broke away from Richard, stepped directly into Harrison's personal space, and informed him that the State Bar Association and the federal prosecutor were currently waiting for him downstairs. Harrison squeezed his eyes shut, hyperventilating as his lucrative decades-long career evaporated into thin air. And then, there was Patricia. My mother sat paralyzed in the front row of the gallery. The sheer velocity of the shock had temporarily frozen her vocal cords. She watched her husband being read his Miranda rights. She watched her son-in-law bleeding slightly onto a legal pad. She watched her favored daughter writhing on the floor in a puddle of her own tears. The reality of her new existence settled deep into her bones. The exclusive country club memberships, the catered dinners, the arrogant superiority she wielded like a weapon against anyone she deemed beneath her were permanently gone. She was the wife of a disgraced felon. She was penniless. Her social standing was utterly obliterated. She looked at me. The facade of the proud, wealthy matriarch completely shattered. Patricia scrambled out of the gallery pew. She tripped over her own feet, falling heavily to the floor. Her expensive designer skirt tore against the sharp corner of a wooden bench. She did not care. She abandoned every ounce of her pride, getting down on her hands and knees. She crawled. She literally crawled across the dirty courtroom carpet, dragging herself toward the low wooden barrier that separated the public gallery from the courtroom floor. She reached the swinging gate, grabbing the wooden railing with trembling, desperate hands. She pulled herself up just enough to look over the top of the bar. Her face was streaked with running black mascara. Her perfectly styled hair was a messy, chaotic tangle. She fell heavily to her knees against the barrier, gripping the wood so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. Tears poured down her face in a pathetic, unrestrained river. She stared up at me, her eyes wide with sheer animalistic terror. "Gwen, please!" she screamed, her voice breaking into a ragged, desperate sob that echoed over the heavy boots of the federal agents. "Please, you are my daughter, save us." I looked down at the woman who had spent 30 years carefully chipping away at my soul. Patricia's hands were raw from gripping the wooden barricade. She was panting, her chest heaving as she waited for me to reach across the divide, pull her up, and act like the obedient, subservient child she had engineered me to be. She genuinely expected me to save her. Even now, after attempting to lock me in a psychiatric ward after helping Richard and DeAndre plot the theft of my entire life, she believed my conditioning would override my survival instinct. She thought the word daughter was a magical incantation that would force me to shield her from the consequences of her own malice. I did not reach out. I did not soften. The hollow ache that used to throb in my chest whenever my mother expressed disappointment was completely gone. In its place was a solid, impenetrable block of ice. I reached up and grabbed the hem of the oversized, frumpy gray sweater I had worn to play the part of the fragile victim. With one fluid motion, I pulled it over my head and tossed it casually onto the respondent's table. Beneath the cheap wool, I wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored midnight blue blouse and a matching blazer. I stood up slowly, letting the heavy wooden chair scrape back against the floor. I squared my shoulders, feeling the familiar heavy drape of the tailored silk against my back. With precise, deliberate movements, I fastened the single center button of my jacket. I smoothed the lapels, my face completely void of emotion. I was no longer the broken scapegoat of the family. I was the chief executive officer of Sentinel Analytics, and I was looking at a ruined woman. "You spent my entire life telling me I did not know my place," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that cut perfectly through the noise of the courtroom. "You told me I was inept. You told me I was a failure. You told everyone who would listen that I was a liability, who needed to be managed, hidden, and controlled." Patricia shook her head frantically, her knuckles turning white against the wood. "I was just trying to protect you. I was being a mother." "You were being a warden," I corrected, stepping closer to the barricade so she could see the absolute zero in my eyes. "You facilitated every cruelty Richard inflicted on me. You cheered when Vanessa mocked me. You signed the papers to lock me in a hospital so your son-in-law could drain my bank accounts to save his own skin." I leaned down slightly, bringing my face level with hers. "You were right, Mom. I don't know my place. Because my place is buying out your bankrupt estate at auction next week and liquidating everything you own." Patricia recoiled as if I had struck her across the face with a lead pipe. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. The realization that I was not just letting them fall, but actively orchestrating their financial demolition finally broke the last fragile thread of her sanity. She collapsed backward onto the floor, joining Vanessa in a heap of ruined silk and hysterical sobs. I straightened up. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Marcus Sterling stepped up beside me, snapping his briefcase shut with a sharp metallic click. He looked at the wreckage of my family, then turned to me with a respectful nod. "Our work here is done, Ms. Vance. The federal prosecutor has everything they need." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady and clear. I turned my back on the screaming and crying. I did not look at Richard being marched toward the holding cells. I did not look at DeAndre weeping against the mahogany table. They were ghosts to me now, echoes of a past life that no longer had any power over my reality. I walked down the center aisle of courtroom 4B. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood, a steady driving beat of absolute victory. I reached the heavy double doors at the back of the chamber. I placed my hands flat against the cool brass push plates and shoved them open. I stepped out of the oppressive stale air of the courthouse and emerged into the bright, blinding sunshine of the city. The crisp afternoon air hit my face, smelling of rain and fresh asphalt. It smelled like freedom. Waiting at the bottom of the wide concrete steps was a sleek midnight black Maybach. My driver Thomas was standing at attention by the rear door. He saw me approaching and immediately pulled the heavy door open, offering a warm, genuine smile. "Good afternoon, Ms. Vance. How did the hearing go?" "Exactly according to plan, Thomas," I said, sliding into the plush, quiet luxury of the leather back seat. "Take me to the office. We have a company to run." "Right away, ma'am." Thomas closed the door, sealing me inside the soundproof cabin. As the engine purred to life, I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen was already lit up with dozens of missed calls and frantic text messages from extended family members who had undoubtedly just received the news of the federal raid on Richard's firm. I did not read a single message. I opened my contact list. I selected Richard, Patricia, Vanessa, and DeAndre. With 4 swift, decisive taps of my thumb, I permanently blocked every single one of their numbers. I deleted their contact files. I erased them from my digital existence as thoroughly as I had just erased them from my actual life. I dropped the phone onto the leather seat beside me and leaned my head back against the headrest. I closed my eyes and took a deep, unobstructed breath. The car glided smoothly away from the curb, merging into the vibrant flow of city traffic, leaving the trash to self-destruct in the rearview mirror. A truly free, brilliant life had finally begun. Gwen's triumphant departure offers a profound lesson on the absolute necessity of establishing uncompromising boundaries with toxic family members. For decades, she was treated as a disposable asset by relatives who demanded her loyalty while actively plotting her ruin. The ultimate takeaway is that blood relations do not entitle anyone to exploit your life, and you owe no allegiance to abusers. True empowerment is realized by possessing the unwavering courage to permanently sever ties with those who only tear you down. Reclaim your independence and protect your peace today. Share your own experiences with setting healthy boundaries and comment below.